Chapter 1 of the Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of the Romans by H.A. Gerber. The First Settlers. You are now going to hear about the building of Rome, the capital of Italy, in Europe. By looking at your maps, you will soon find in Europe a peninsula, shaped somewhat like a boot, and surrounded on three sides by the Mediterranean and Adriatic seas. This peninsula is Italy. To the north are the snow-topped Alps, a chain of high mountains which separate this country from the rest of Europe. And through the peninsula run the Apennines, a less lofty mountain range. As Italy is in the southern part of Europe, it has a very mild and delightful climate. The tall mountains in the north prevent the cold winds from sweeping down upon it, and many plants which you see here in hothouses grow there in the open ground. Orange and almond trees, camellias and pomegranates are all covered with fruit or flowers, and the vine and olive both yield rich harvests in this beautiful land. The soil is so rich that people do not need to work very hard in order to have fine crops, and, as the weather is generally clear, they can live out of doors almost all the year round. As the climate is so pleasant, the land so fertile, the sky so blue, and the views so beautiful, travelers have always liked to visit Italy, and have spoken about its charms to all they met. It is no wonder, therefore, that many people have gone to settle there, and you will easily understand that the whole country was occupied long, long ago. So many years ago that no one can really tell when it was, Italy was already inhabited by a people who, judging from what we have heard of them, must once have lived in Central Asia. These people were probably crowded at home, and left their native land in search of good pasture for their cattle, and a fertile country where they might dwell. They traveled on, day after day, and coming finally to the great mountains, some of them climbed up to see what was on the other side. When they beheld the green valleys of Italy, and saw how beautiful the country was, they told their companions, and all made haste across the mountains. These people traveled on foot, with their families, cattle, and all their household goods, and they were very rude and uncivilized. Little by little, however, they learned to build houses, to cook their food, to make rude pottery from the clay they found in the valleys, to spin and weave the wool from their sheep, and to fashion this homemade stuff into garments. Although each family at first lived by itself, they soon discovered that if several families joined together, they could cultivate the ground better, could hunt more successfully, and that in time of danger they could more easily defend themselves. Thus several families would form a tribe under the strongest and cleverest man among them, whom they chose as their leader. These leaders selected the best place for them to settle in, told them what to do in time of war, and thus became chiefs or kings over their own tribes. There were a number of such little kingdoms scattered throughout Italy, and as the people grew richer, wiser, and more numerous, they occupied more and more land. Now it was from some of these tribes that the Romans were mostly descended. Their city became in time the greatest in the world, and many histories have been written about it. But none of them were begun until several centuries after Rome was founded. Hardly any records had been kept of the distant past, and the best that could be done was to write down some stories that had been told by parents to their children, and thus had been preserved from generation to generation. These had become much changed by being told so many times, and they were connected and rounded out by pure guesswork. But the whole was soon accepted as true, and was believed in by everyone for ages. You will now read the story from the beginning, as the Romans themselves told it. Many of the events in the first part of it never really happened, But no one can tell exactly where the mere stories leave off and the true history begins. And every well-educated person is expected to know the whole story. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of the Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of the Romans by H.A. GUERBER. Chapter 2. The Escape from the Burning City. In the days when the Greeks were fighting against Troy, that great city in Asia Minor which they besieged for 10 years, the people in Italy were divided into several small kingdoms, among which were those of the Etruscans and the Latins. The Etruscans occupied the northern part of Italy, or the top of the boot, and called their country Etruria, while the Latins dwelt farther south, in a province named Latium. Each of these kingdoms had its own leader or king, whom all the people obeyed. Now the king of Latium in those days was Latinus. He had a beautiful daughter called Lavinia, and as soon as she was old enough to marry, he thought of getting her a good husband. One night King Latinus dreamed that the gods of his country came and spoke to him, telling him to be sure and give his daughter in marriage to a stranger whom they would send to Latium. When Latinus awoke, he was very much troubled, because his wife was anxious that Lavinia should marry Turnus, a neighboring king. The queen soon persuaded Latinus to allow this engagement to take place, but he insisted that the marriage should be postponed for some time longer. In the meanwhile, the city of Troy had at last fallen into the hands of the Greeks. The brave Trojans were attacked by night, and only a few among them managed to escape death. Among these few, however, there was a prince named Aeneas. His father was Anchises, the cousin of the king of Troy, and his mother was Venus, the goddess of beauty. As Venus did not want her son to die with the rest of the Trojans, she appeared to him during the fatal night when the Greeks had secretly entered Troy and were plundering and burning the houses. She showed him that resistance would be useless, and bade him flee from the city with all his family. Aeneas had been taught to obey every word the gods said, so he at once stopped fighting and hurried back to his house. Then he lifted his poor old father up on his back, took his little son Iulus by the hand, and called to his wife and servants to follow him. This strange group of fugitives quickly passed out of the city, where the flames were now rising on all sides, and, under cover of the darkness, made their way to a temple nearby. Here they paused to rest, and Aeneas counted his followers to make sure that they were all there. Imagine his sorrow when he found that his beloved wife was missing. He rushed back into the burning city and searched everywhere for her, calling her name aloud in spite of the danger. At last he met someone who told him that his wife had been killed, and that she wished him to escape to a better country, where he should found a new kingdom, and where a new wife should take her place, and make him happy once more. Aeneas sorrowfully turned back, and at the temple found that his followers had been joined by others who had managed to escape unseen amid the smoke and darkness. He led the way to a place of safety, and not long afterwards set sail with his little band of faithful Trojans, who all promised to obey and follow him wherever he went. The ships drifted aimlessly for a long time, because Aeneas had no idea where he was to found his new kingdom. Twice he tried to settle down, but each time something happened to drive him away. Finally he asked the advice of his father, Anchises, a wise and pious old man, who had snatched up his gods when he left his house, and had brought them with him on the ship. The old man now said that he would consult these images, and he offered them a sacrifice. The next night Aeneas dreamed that the gods spoke to him and told him that he should go to Italy, a land whence one of his ancestors had come to Troy. The little band therefore sailed for the west, although it was foretold that they would have to suffer many hardships ere they could reach Italy, and that they would not be able to settle until they had eaten the very boards upon which their food was served. As Aeneas was a brave man, the prospect of a terrible famine did not fill his heart with despair, and he calmly sailed on in search of a home. There are almost countless islands in that part of the Mediterranean, and thus the boats were seldom out of sight of land. They stopped from time to time, but Aeneas did not dare to settle anywhere, because he thought the gods opposed it. And he always urged his people to embark again and sail on. The Trojans were by this time very tired of sailing, but they loved Aeneas so well that they gladly followed him, although they would have liked to make their homes in the islands they visited. End of Chapter 2.
Chapter 3 of the Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Philippi Vogel. The Story of the Romans by H.A. Gerber. Chapter 3 The Clever Trick. After many days of sailing thus on the blue waters of the Mediterranean, and after much suffering in the different islands where they stopped to rest, Aeneas and his companions came at last to the island of Sicily. This, as you will see on your maps, is a three-cornered piece of land, near the toe of the boot formed by the Italian peninsula. While the Trojans were resting here, poor old Anchises died, and was buried by his sorrowing son. But as soon as the funeral rites were ended, Aeneas prepared to sail away, for he knew that this was not the place where he was to make his new home. Unfortunately for Aeneas, some of the gods whom his people had so long worshipped had taken a dislike to all the Trojan race. It was these gods who made him suffer so much, and one of them now stirred up a terrible tempest. The boats were tossed up and down on the waves, and driven apart by the fierce winds, and some of them sank under the water. The other vessels would have been dashed to pieces, and all of the men on board would have perished, had not a second god interfered in favor of Aeneas, and suddenly stilled the awful storm. The wind was so high, the darkness so great, and the lightning flashes so blinding, that Aeneas had lost his bearings. When the storm was over, he sailed for the nearest land, and came to the coast of what is now Tunis. But he had no idea where he was. He therefore bade his companions remain on the ships, while he went ashore with only one man, the faithful Achimedes, who always went with him and was his devoted friend. So these two men started out and began cautiously to explore the country where they had landed, trying to find someone who could tell them where they were. Before long they met a beautiful woman. This was Venus, the mother of Aeneas, in disguise. She had come here to tell her son all about the place where he had landed, and to give him some good advice. But she did not wish to have him know her at first. Venus, therefore, began to speak to Aeneas as if he were a stranger, and in answer to his questions said that he had landed in Africa, near the new city of Carthage. This town, she said, was ruled by Dido, a beautiful queen who had also come from the coast of Asia, but from a spot southeast of the ruined city of Troy. Dido's husband had been murdered by her brother, and she had fled in the night upon one of her vessels, carrying off all her treasures, for she knew that her brother would soon try to kill her also. Many of her faithful subjects followed her, swearing that they would settle wherever she wished, and promising to help her found a new kingdom, of which she should be queen. When Dido reached the coast of Africa, near the present city of Tunis, and saw how beautiful the country seemed, she wished to settle there. but the people refused to sell her the land on which to build a city. She tried in vain to persuade them, and finally made up her mind to secure the land by a clever trick. She therefore asked the people if they would be willing to sell her as much land as an ox hide would enclose. The rude people were quite ready to part with a few measures of dirt, so the bargain was at once made. Imagine their surprise, however, when Dido had a large ox skin cut up into very narrow strips, drew these around a vast tract of land, and claimed it as her own. As the land had certainly been enclosed by an ox hide, they could not dispute her right to it, and Dido at once began to build a beautiful city, about which you will hear many tales. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of the Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Philippe Vogel. The Story of the Romans by H. A. Gerber. Chapter 4. The Boards are Eaten. Venus went away after telling her son the story of the ox hide and the founding of Carthage, and Aeneas, following her advice, then walked on to the city. Here he was kindly received by the beautiful queen, who made him and all his companions welcome in her palace. While there, Aeneas told her all about the long siege of Troy, the taking of the city, his escape by night, his long wanderings on the sea, and his shipwreck near her city. These stories greatly interested Dido, and she kept Aeneas in her palace almost a whole year. As she had fallen in love with him, she would have liked to keep him there always, but the gods had decided that Aeneas should again set sail, and one day they sent him orders to depart at once. Aeneas knew that Dido would do her best to keep him in Carthage, so he stole away while she slept, without even bidding her good-bye. When she awoke and asked for him, his ships were almost out of sight. In her grief at his departure, Dido made up her mind to die. She gave orders that all the things he had used during his visit should be placed on a great pile of wood. Then she set fire to it by her own hand, and stabbing herself, sprang into the flames, where she died. Of course, we know that such a deed is a crime, but in the days of Queen Dido, people had not learned many of the things that are now taught even to children, and they thought it was very brave to take one's own life. Aeneas and his companions, having left Carthage, now sailed back to Sicily, where they visited the tomb of Anchises just 1 year after his death. To show respect for his father's memory, Aeneas ordered the celebration of games, as was the custom among the Trojans. The men strove with one another in a boat race, a foot race, in boxing and archery matches, and the boys took part in a drill and sham battle on horseback. After the games were over, the Trojans coasted along the shore of Italy for some time, and finally came to the mouth of the Tiber River. When Aeneas saw the fair country that stretched out before him, he bade his men sail up the stream, and towards evening they all went ashore to cook their food. Some flat cakes were baked, and as they had no dishes with them, Iulus proposed that these should serve as plates. The men all sat down around the fire, and Iulus, who was very hungry indeed, quickly ate his share of meat, and then devoured the cake on which it had been placed. As he swallowed the last mouthful, he cried, "Just see how hungry I was! I have eaten even the board on which my meal was served." At these words, Aeneas sprang to his feet, and cried that the prophecy was fulfilled at last, and that now they could settle in the beautiful country they had reached. The next day they were welcomed by Latinus, king of Latium, who, after hearing their story, remembered his dream, and promised that Aeneas should have his daughter Lavinia in marriage. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of the Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Philippi Vogel. The Story of the Romans by H. A. Gerber. Chapter 5. The Wolf and the Twins. Although Aeneas had been so kindly welcomed to Latium by the king, his troubles were not yet ended. Turnus, the young king who had been engaged to Lavinia, was angry at her being given to another, and, in the hope of winning her still, he declared war against the Trojan strangers. During the war, Aeneas and Turnus both won much glory by their courage. At last they met in single combat, in which Turnus was conquered and slain, and Aeneas, having thus got rid of his rival, married the fair princess. He then settled in Latium, where he built a city which was called Lavinium, in honor of his wife. Some time after, Aeneas fell in battle and was succeeded by his sons. The Trojans and Latins were now united, and during the next 400 years the descendants of Aeneas continued to rule over them, for this was the kingdom which the gods had promised him when he fled from Troy. The throne of Latium finally came to Numitor, a good and wise monarch. He had a son and a daughter, and little suspected that anyone would harm either of them. Unfortunately for him, however, his brother Amulius was anxious to secure the throne. He took advantage of Numitor's confidence, and, having driven his brother away, killed his nephew and forced his niece, Rhea Silvia, to become a servant of the goddess Vesta. The girls who served this goddess were called Vestal Virgins. They were obliged to remain in her temple for 30 years, and were not allowed to marry until their time of service was ended. They watched over a sacred fire in the temple to prevent its ever going out, because such an event was expected to bring misfortune upon the people. If any Vestal Virgin proved careless and allowed the sacred fire to go out, or if she failed to keep her vow to remain single, she was punished by being buried alive. With such a terrible fate in view, you can easily understand that the girls were very obedient, and Amulius thought that there was no danger of his niece's marrying as long as she served Vesta. We are told, however, that Mars, the god of war, once came down upon earth. He saw the lovely Rhea Silvia, fell in love with her, wooed her secretly, and finally persuaded her to marry him without telling anyone about it. For some time all went well, and no one suspected that Rhea Silvia, the Vestal Virgin, had married the god of war. But one day a messenger came to tell Amulius that his niece was the mother of twin sons. The king flew into a passion at this news, and vainly tried to discover the name of Rhea Silvia's husband. She refused to tell it, and Amulius gave orders that she should be buried alive. Her twin children, Romulus and Remus, were also condemned to die. But instead of burying them alive with their mother, Amulius had them placed in their cradle and set adrift on the Tiber River. The king thought that the babes would float out to sea, where they would surely perish. But the cradle drifted ashore before it had gone far. There the cries of the hungry children were heard by a she-wolf. This poor beast had just lost her cubs, which a cruel hunter had killed. So instead of devouring the babies, the she-wolf suckled them as if they were the cubs she had lost. And the Romans used to tell their children that a woodpecker brought the twins fresh berries to eat. Thus kept alive by the care of a wolf and a bird, the children remained on the edge of the river until a shepherd passed that way. He heard a strange noise in a thicket, and on going there to see what was the matter, found the children with the wolf. Of course the shepherd was greatly surprised at this sight, but he took pity on the poor babies, and carried them home to his wife, who brought them up. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of the Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Philippi Vogel. The Story of the Romans by H. A. Gerber. Chapter 6. Romulus builds Rome. Remus and Romulus, the twins who had been nursed by the she-wolf, grew up among the shepherds. They were tall and strong, and so brave that all their companions were ready to follow them anywhere. One day, when they were watching their flocks on the hillside, their pasture was claimed by the shepherds who were working for Numitor. The young men were angry at this, and as the shepherds would not go away, they began to fight. As they were only 2 against many, they were soon made prisoners, and were led before Numitor. Their strong resemblance to the royal family roused the old man's suspicions. He began to question them, and soon the young men found out who they were. Then they called together a few of their bravest companions, and entered the city of Alba, where Amusements dwelt. The unjust king, taken by surprise, was easily killed, and the brothers made haste to place their grandfather, Numitor, again on the throne. Remus and Romulus were too restless and fond of adventure to enjoy the quiet life at Alba, so they soon left their grandfather's court to found a kingdom of their own. They had decided that they would settle in the northern part of Latium, on the banks of the Tiber, in a place where 7 hills rose above the surrounding plain. Here the 2 brothers said that they would build their future city. Before beginning, however, they thought it would be well to give the city a name. Each wanted the honor of naming it, and each wanted to rule over it when it was built. As they were twins, neither was willing to give up to the other, and as they were both hot-tempered and obstinate, they soon began to quarrel. Their companions then suggested that they should stand on separate hills the next day, and let the gods decide the question by a sign from the heavens. Remus, watching the sky carefully, suddenly cried that he saw 6 vultures. A moment later, Romulus exclaimed that he could see 12. So the naming of the city was awarded to him, and he said that it should be called Rome. The next thing was to draw a furrow all around the hill chosen as the most favorable site. The name of this hill was the Palatine. Romulus, therefore, harnessed a bullock and a heifer together, and began to plow the place where the wall of the town was to be built. Remus, disappointed in his hopes of claiming the city, began to taunt his brother, and, in a fit of anger, Romulus killed him. Although this was a horrible crime, Romulus felt no remorse, and went on building his capital. All the hot-headed and discontented men from the neighboring kingdoms soon joined him, and the new city, which was founded 753 years before Christ, thus became the home of lawless men. The city of Rome was at first composed of a series of mud huts, and as Romulus had been brought up among shepherds, he was quite satisfied with a palace thatched with rushes. As the number of his subjects increased, however, the town grew larger and richer, and before long it became a prosperous city, covering 2 hills instead of 1. On the second hill, the Romans built a fortress, or citadel, which was perched on top of great rocks, and was the safest place in case of an attack by an enemy. This is the city of which you are going to read the story. You will learn in these pages how it grew in wealth and power until it finally became the most important place in the world, and won for itself the name of the Eternal City. End of chapter 6.
Chapter 7 of the Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of the Romans by H.A. Gerber. The Maidens Carried Off. As all the robbers, murderers, and runaway slaves of the kingdoms nearby had come to settle in Rome, there were soon plenty of men there. Only a few of them, however, had wives, so women were very scarce indeed. The Romans, anxious to secure wives, tried to coax the girls of the neighboring states to marry them, but as they had a reputation of being fierce and lawless, their wooing was all in vain. Romulus knew that the men would soon leave him if they could not have wives, so he resolved to help them get by a trick what they could not secure by fair means. Sending out trumpeters into all the neighboring towns and villages, he invited the people to come to Rome and see the games which the Romans were going to celebrate in honor of one of their gods. As these games were wrestling and boxing matches, horse and foot races, and many other tests of strength and skill, all the people were anxious to see them, so they came to Rome in crowds, unarmed, and in holiday attire. Whole families came to see the fun, and among the spectators were many of the young women whom the Romans wanted for wives. Romulus waited until the games were well under way. Then he suddenly gave a signal, and all the young Romans caught up the girls in their arms and carried them off to the houses, in spite of their cries and struggles. The fathers, brothers, and lovers of the captive maidens would gladly have defended them, but they had come to the games unarmed and could not strike a blow. As the Romans refused to give up the girls, they rushed home for their weapons, but when they came back, the gates of Rome were closed. While these men were raging outside the city, the captive maidens had been forced to marry their captors, who now vowed that no one should rob them of their newly won wives, and prepared to resist every attack. Most of the women that had been thus won came from some Sabine villages, and the Romans had easy work to conquer all their enemies, until they were called upon to fight the Sabines. The war with them lasted a long time, for neither side was much stronger than the other. At last, in the 3rd year, the Sabines secured an entrance to the citadel by bribing Tarpeia, the daughter of the gatekeeper. This girl was so vain and so fond of ornaments that she would have done anything to get some. She therefore promised to open the gates and let the Sabine warriors enter during the night, if each of them would give her what he wore on his left arm, meaning a broad armlet of gold. The Sabines promised to give her all she asked, and Tarpeia opened the gates. As the warriors filed past her, she claimed her reward, and each man, scorning her for her meanness, flung the heavy bronze buckler, which he also wore on his left arm, straight at her. Tarpeia sank to the ground at the first blow, and was crushed to death under the weight of the heavy shields. She fell at the foot of a steep rock or cliff, which has ever since been known as the Tarpeian Rock. From the top of this cliff the Romans used to hurl their criminals, so that they might be killed by the fall. In this way many other persons came to die on the spot where the faithless girl had once stood, when she offered to sell the city to the enemy for the sake of a few trinkets. End of chapter 7. The Maidens Carried Off. Chapter 8 of the Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of the Romans by H.A. Gerber. Union of Sabines and Romans. The Sabine army had taken the citadel thanks to Tarpeia's vanity, and on the next day there was a desperate fight between them and the Romans who lived on the Palatine Hill. First the Romans and then the Sabines were beaten back, and finally both sides paused to rest. The battle was about to begin again, and the two armies were only a few feet apart, threatening each other with raised weapons and fiery glances, when all at once the women rushed out of their houses and flung themselves between the warriors. In frantic terror for the lives of their husbands on one side, and of their fathers and brothers on the other, they wildly besought them not to fight. Those who had little children held them up between the lines of soldiers, and the sight of these innocent babes disarmed the rage of both parties. Instead of fighting any more, therefore, the Romans and Sabines agreed to lay down their arms and to become friends. A treaty was made, whereby the Sabines were invited to come and live in Rome, and Romulus even agreed to share his throne with their king, Tatius. Thus the two rival nations became one, and when Tatius died, the Sabines were quite willing to obey Romulus, who was, at first, an excellent king, and made many wise laws. As it was too great a risk for him to govern the unruly people alone, Romulus soon formed an assembly of the oldest and most respected men, to whom he gave the name of senators. They were at first the advisers of the king, but in later times they had the right to make laws for the good of the people, and to see that these laws were obeyed. The younger and more active men were named cavaliers or knights. These were the men who fought as horsemen in time of war, but before long the name was given only to those who had a certain amount of wealth. The sons and relatives of the senators and knights, and all the earliest inhabitants of Rome, received also the name of patricians or nobles, while the people whom they had conquered, or who came to dwell there later, were called plebeians, or ordinary people. End of Chapter 8. Union of Sabines and Romans.
Chapter 9 of the Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of the Romans by H.A. Gerber. Chapter 9, Death of Romulus. We are told that Romulus reigned over the Romans for 37 years. Although he was at first a very good ruler, he soon grew proud and cruel. As he was king, he wanted to have his own way in everything, and as he soon ceased to care whether what he wished would be good for the Romans, they began to dislike him. A man who thinks only of himself can have no real friends, and Romulus soon stood alone. But although the people hated him, they feared him too much to defy him openly and show him their displeasure. One day, when Romulus and all the people had gone to the plain beyond the citadel, a sudden storm arose. The darkness became so great that the people fled in terror, leaving the senators and king to look out for themselves. When the storm was over, the Romans all came back again. To their surprise, however, Romulus did not appear. He was sent for, but no one could find him. The people were amazed, and were all talking about his sudden disappearance, and wondering what could have become of him, when one of the senators stood up and called for silence. As soon as he could make himself heard, this man told the assembled Romans that he had seen Romulus being carried up to heaven. The king, he said, had called out that he was going to live with the gods, and wished his people to worship him under the name of Quirinus. The Romans in those days were so ignorant and superstitious that they believed all this man told them. They therefore built a temple on the hill whence the senator said that Romulus had risen to heaven. This hill was called Mount Quirinal, and here for many years the Romans worshipped Romulus, the founder of their city and their first king, whom they now called Quirinus. In later times the Romans did not believe that Romulus was carried up to heaven, and many of them thought that the senators were so tired of the king's tyranny that they murdered him during the storm, cut his body to pieces, and carried it off, hidden under their long mantles. End of Chapter 9.
Chapter 10 of the Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kelvin D., Minneapolis. www.kelvind.com. The Story of the Romans by H.A. Gerber. Chapter 10. The Strange Signs of the Romans. Although the senator had told the Romans that Romulus had gone, never to return, they did not at once elect another king. They were afraid that their first ruler might yet come back, and so they let the Senate govern the city for a while alone. As time passed on without bringing any news of the missing king, they little by little grew sure that he would never return, and finally they elected a new ruler. This was Numa Pompilius, a Sabine, who was wise, just, gentle, and very good. The new king of Rome was a pious man, and he built many temples for the worship of the gods. One of these was round, and was set aside for the service of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, whose fire was guarded night and day by the Vestal virgins. Numa also built a square temple in honor of the double-faced god Janus. This god was supposed to be the patron of all beginnings, and it is for this reason that the first month of the year was called January, or the month of Janus. The temple of Janus was built in the form of a gateway, and the king ordered that its doors should be open in time of war, so that the people could go in freely to pray, and closed only in time of peace, when they felt no need of the god's help. The second king of Rome was so wise that many people fancied that he was advised by a nymph or water fairy called Egeria. They said that this nymph lived in a fountain near Rome, in a beautiful spot which the king liked to visit, and whenever he went there to be quiet and to think, they declared that it was to consult Egeria. Numa Pompilius was not at all ambitious, and he had no wish to be king. He had accepted the office, therefore, only on condition that the people would obey him and would try to be good. Now, as you know, the Romans were a fighting people, and until then they had always been at war with some of their neighbors. But the new king made them keep the peace and closed the gates of the temple of Janus. Then he taught the Romans how to plow their fields, bade them sow and harvest grain, and showed them that farming was a far better and wise occupation than war. The people were very superstitious, and thought that the stars, the weather, the flight of birds, and the actions of certain animals were signs of what would happen if you could only understand them aright. Numa, therefore, said that there should be 2 companies of priests, whose duty it should be to tell what the gods wished in a way that the people could understand. In the first place, there were the pontiffs, priests who had general charge of all public worship, and who told the people which days would be lucky and which ones unlucky. The other company of priests were called augurs. They watched the changes in the weather, the flight of the birds, and the behavior of the geese which they kept in the temple. By observing these things carefully, they thought they could tell the future, and the people often asked them the meaning of certain signs, such as the sudden appearance of some bird or animal on their right or left side when they were starting out on a journey. Of course, all this was mere nonsense, yet some people still believe in these foolish things. You have all heard the saying, "See a pin and pick it up, all the day you'll have good luck," and "If your left ear burns, someone is talking ill of you." It was such signs as these that the Romans believed in, and the augurs were supposed to know all about them and to explain them to the people. Besides the pontiffs and augurs, there was a lower class of priests called haruspices, who told the future by means of sacrifices. In those days the Romans used to offer up bulls, goats, sheep, and other animals on the altars of their gods. It was the duty of these priests to kill the animals, open them, burn certain parts, and carefully examine the insides of the victims. The haruspices thought that they could see signs in the bodies of the animals they had sacrificed, and that these signs gave them very important knowledge. Of course, this was all humbug, but the early Romans believed that the priests could thus learn much about the future. As these Romans lived a long time ago, and had few chances to learn, their mistakes were very excusable. For you know it is no shame to be ignorant when one has no chance to learn, but it is a very great shame to be ignorant in such a country as this, where you can all attend good schools, and have teachers to explain anything you do not understand. Nowadays, when people believe in such silly things as signs, they are said to be superstitious, but as soon as they learn more, they see how foolish they have been. End of Chapter 10. The Strange Signs of the Romans. Recording by Kelvin D., Minneapolis. www.kelvind.com.
Chapter 11 of the Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of the Romans by H.A. Gerber. Chapter 11. The Quarrel with Alba. For a long time the Roman people were in the habit of burying their dead. But by and by they began to burn the bodies, and keep the ashes in little urns. When Numa Pompilius died, however, the people laid his body in a stone coffin. Many years later, so the Romans said, a farmer in plowing came across the tomb. He opened it, and found in the coffin, besides the king's bones, a number of old books. In them were written the laws which Numa Pompilius had made for his people, and an account of the religious ceremonies of his day. The farmer, unfortunately, was a very ignorant man. He fancied that such old and musty books were of no value, and so he burned them up. By doing this, he destroyed a very great treasure, for if he had kept those ancient books, we would know much more about the early Romans than we do now. As Numa was so good and wise a king, the people felt very sorry to lose him, and they said that his death was mourned even by the water nymph Egeria. The Roman mothers used to tell their children that this nymph wept so many tears that the gods, in pity, changed her into a fountain which still bears her name. Numa Pompilius had no son to take his place on the throne, so the senators elected Tullus Hostilius, a patrician, as the third king of Rome. Unlike the former king, the new ruler was proud and quarrelsome, and, as he enjoyed fighting, the Romans were soon called to war. Tullus first quarreled with his neighbors in Alba, the city where Amulius and Numitor had once reigned. Neither people was willing to yield to the other, and yet each disliked to begin the bloodshed, for they saw that they were about equally matched, and that their fighting would end only with their lives. As they could not wait forever, the two parties finally decided to settle their quarrel by a fair fight between three picked warriors on either side. The Albans selected as their champions three brothers named Curiatii, all noted for their strength, their courage, and their great skill in handling arms. The Romans made an equally careful choice, and selected three brothers from the Horatius family. These 6 men are called the Curiatii and the Horatii, because these are the plural forms of their names in Latin, which was the language of both Rome and Alba. Now, in the peaceful days of Numa Pompilius, long before there had been any thought of war, the Romans and Albans had often visited each other, and the Horatii and Curiatii were great friends. Indeed, the two families were so intimate that one of the Curiatii was engaged to marry Camilla, the sister of the Horatii. In spite of this long-standing friendship, both families would have considered it a disgrace not to fight when selected as their country's champions. And in spite of Camilla's tears and entreaties, all 6 young men prepared for the coming contest. Poor Camilla was in despair, for either her brothers would kill her lover, or he would kill them. No matter which way the battle ended, it could not fail to bring sorrow and loss to her, for she was deeply attached to her brothers and lover, and she tried again and again to make them give up this fight. End of chapter 11.
Chapter 12 of The Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kevin Neiman. The Story of the Romans by H.A. Gerber. Chapter 12. The fight between the Horatii and the Curiatii. The Romans and Albans had all assembled to view the battle between their champions, and were eagerly awaiting the struggle which was to decide their fate. They had agreed that the nation which won should rule over the one which was worsted in the fight that was about to begin. Encouraged to do their best by the feeling that so much depended upon their valor, the Horatii and Curiatii met. The Romans and Albans stationed on either side watched the encounter with breathless interest and in anxious silence. The 6 young men were equally brave and well trained, but before long 2 of the Horatii fell, never to rise again. Only one of the Roman champions was left to uphold their cause, but he was quite unhurt, while all 3 of his enemies had received severe wounds. The Curiatii were still able to fight, however, and all 3 turned their attention to the last Horatius. They hoped to dispatch him quickly so as to secure the victory for Alba before the loss of blood made them too weak to fight. The Roman champion knew that he would not be able to keep these 3 foes at bay, and he noticed how eager they were to bring the battle to a speedy close. To prevent that, he made up his mind to separate them, if possible, in order to fight them one by one. He therefore made believe to run away, and was followed, as quickly as their strength allowed, by the Curiatii, who taunted him for his cowardice, and bade him stand and fight. The 3 wounded men ran on as fast as they could, and were soon some distance apart, for the one whose wounds were slightest had soon left the others behind. Horatius turned his head, saw that his enemies were now too far apart to help one another, and suddenly rushed back to attack them. A short, sharp encounter took place, and the first of the Curiatii fell, just as one of his brothers came to help him. To kill this second foe, weakened as he was by the loss of blood and by the efforts he had made to hurry, was but the work of a moment. The second Curiatius sank beneath his enemy's sword just as the last of the Alban brothers appeared beside him. With the courage of despair, this Curiatius tried to strike a blow for his country, but he too fell, leaving the victory to Horatius, the sole survivor among the 6 brave warriors who had begun the fight. The Romans had seen 2 of their champions fall, and the 3rd take refuge in what seemed to be cowardly flight, and they fancied that their honor and liberty were both lost. Imagine their joy, therefore, when they saw Horatius turn, kill one enemy after another, and remain victor on the field. Shout after shout rent the air, and the Romans were almost beside themselves with pride and gladness, when the Alban king came over and publicly said that he and his people would obey Rome. Leaving the Albans to bury their dead and bewail the loss of their liberty, the Romans led their young champion back to the city with every sign of approval and joy. Compliments and praise were showered upon the young men, who in token of victory had put on the embroidered mantle of one of his foes. Every one received him joyfully as he entered the city, every one except his sister Camilla. When she saw the mantle which she had woven and embroidered for her betrothed, she burst into tears. In her sorrow she could not hold her tongue, and bitterly reproached her brother for killing her lover. Horatius, angry at being thus reproved, roughly bade Camilla dry her tears, and told her that she was not worthy of being a Roman, since she welcomed her country's triumph with tears. As she kept on crying, after this harsh reproof, Horatius suddenly raised his hand and struck her a deadly blow with the same sword which had taken her lover's life. The sight of this heartless murder made the Romans so angry that they wanted to put the young man to death, in spite of the service he had just rendered his country. But his aged father implored them to spare his life. He said that 2 of his sons were lying on the battlefield, where they had given their lives for Rome, that his lovely daughter Camilla was no more, and that the people ought to leave his only remaining child as a prop for his old age. When Tullus Hostilius heard this pitiful request, he promised to forgive Horatius upon condition that he would lead the Roman army to Alba and raze the walls of that ancient city as had been agreed. The Albans were then brought to Rome and settled at the foot of the Cilian Hill, one of the 7 heights of the city. By other conquests, Tullus increased the number of his people still more, but as the streets were not yet paved, and there were no drains, the town soon became very unhealthful. A plague broke out among the people, many sickened and died, and among them perished Tullus Hostilius. End of chapter 12. Recording by Kevin Neiman. Chapter 13 of The Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kevin Neiman. The Story of the Romans by H.A. Gerber. Chapter 13. Tarquin and the Eagle. As Tullus Hostilius was dead, the Romans wished to elect a new king, and they soon chose Ancus Martius, a grandson of the good and pious Numa Pompilius, who had governed them so well. The new ruler was very wise and good, although he could not keep peace with all his neighbors, as his grandfather had done. He never went to war except when compelled to do so. There were now so many people in Rome that it was not easy to govern them as before. In fact, there were so many wrongdoers that Ancus was soon forced to build a prison in which the criminals could be put while awaiting judgment. The prison was made as solid as possible, with thick stone walls. It was so strong that it still exists, and one can even now visit the deep and dark dungeons where the prisoners used to be kept more than 600 years before Christ. During the reign of Ancus Martius, as in those of the kings before him, many strangers came to settle in Rome. They were attracted thither by the rapid growth of the city, by the freedom which the citizens enjoyed, and by the chances offered to grow rich and powerful. Among these strangers was a very wealthy Greek who had lived for some time in a neighboring town called Tarquini. This man is known as Tarquinius Priscus, or simply Tarquin, a name given him to remind people where he had lived before he came to Rome. As Tarquin was rich, he did not come to Rome on foot, but rode in a chariot with his wife, Tanaquil. As they were driving along, an eagle came into view, and after circling for a while above them, suddenly swooped down and snatched Tarquin's cap off his head. A moment later, it flew down again and replaced the cap on Tarquin's head, without doing him any harm. This was a very strange thing for an eagle to do, as you can see, and Tarquin wondered what it could mean. After thinking the matter over for a while, he asked his wife Tanaquil, who knew a great deal about signs, and she said it meant that he would sometime be king of Rome. This prophecy pleased Tarquin very much, because he was ambitious and fond of ruling. Tarquin and his wife were so rich and powerful that they were warmly welcomed by the Romans. They took up their abode in the city, spent their money freely, tried to make themselves as agreeable as possible, and soon made a number of friends among the patricians. Ancus Martius became acquainted with Tarquin, and, finding him a good adviser, often sent for him to talk about the affairs of state. Little by little, the man grew more and more intimate with the king, and when Ancus died, after a reign of about 24 years, no one was surprised to hear that he had left his 2 young sons in Tarquin's care. End of chapter 13. Recording by Kevin Neiman.
Chapter 14 of The Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Winona Wyatt. The Story of the Romans by H.A. Gerber. Chapter 14. The Roman Youths. As you have seen, the Romans were generally victorious in the wars which they waged against their neighbors. They were so successful, however, only because they were remarkably well trained. Not very far from the citadel there was a broad plain, bordered on one side by the Tiber. This space had been set aside from the very beginning as an exercising ground for the youths of Rome, who were taught to develop their muscles in every way. The young men met there every day to drill, run races, wrestle, box, and swim in the Tiber. These daily exercises on the field of Mars, as this plain was called, soon made them brave, hardy, and expert, and as a true Roman considered it beneath him to do anything but fight, the king thus had plenty of soldiers at his disposal. Ancus Marcius had greatly encouraged the young men in all these athletic exercises, and often went out to watch them as they went through their daily drill. He also took great interest in the army, and divided the soldiers into regiments, or legions as they were called in Rome. As the city was on a river, about 15 miles from the sea, Ancus thought it would be a very good thing to have a seaport connected with it. So he built a harbor at Ostia, a town at the mouth of the Tiber. Between the city and the port there was a long, straight road, which was built with the greatest care, and made so solidly that it is still in use today. To last so long, a road had to be made in a different way from those which are built today. The Romans used to dig a deep trench as long and as wide as the road they intended to make. Then the trench was nearly filled with stones of different sizes, packed tightly together. On top of this thick layer they laid great blocks of stone, forming a strong and even pavement. A road like this, with a solid bed several feet deep, could not be washed out by the spring rains, but was smooth and hard in all seasons. Little by little, the Romans built many other roads, which ran out of Rome in all directions. From this arose the saying, which is still very popular in Europe, and which you will often hear, "All roads lead to Rome." The most famous of all the Roman roads was the Appian Way, leading from Rome southeast to Brundusium, a distance of 300 miles. This road, although built about 2,000 years ago, is still in good condition, showing how careful the Romans were in their work. End of Chapter 14. The Roman Youths. Recording by Winona Wyatt.
Chapter 15 of the Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jane Kublavatsky. The Story of the Romans by H.A. Gerber. Chapter 15. The King Outwitted. Tarquin was the guardian of the sons of Ancus Marcius, but as he was anxious to be king of Rome himself, he said that these lads were far too young to reign wisely, and soon persuaded the people to give him the crown instead. Although Tarquin thus gained his power wrongfully, he proved to be a very good king, and did all he could to improve and beautify the city of Rome. To make the place more healthful, and to prevent another plague like the one which had killed Tullus Hostilius, he built a great drain or sewer all across the city. This drain, which is called the Cloaca Maxima, also served to carry off the water from the swampy places between the hills on which Rome was built. As Tarquin knew that work properly done will last a long while, he was very particular about the building of this sewer. He had it made so large that several teams of oxen could pass in it abreast, and the work was so well done that the drain is still perfect today, although the men who planned and built it have been dead more than 2,400 years. Strangers who visit Rome are anxious to see this ancient piece of masonry, and all of them praise the builders who did their work so carefully. One place which this great sewer drained was the Forum, an open space which was used as a marketplace, and which Tarquin surrounded with covered walks. Here the Romans were in the habit of coming to buy and sell, and to talk over the news of the day. In later times they came here also to discuss public affairs, and near the center of the Forum was erected a stand from which men could make speeches to the people. Tarquin also built a huge open-air circus for the Romans, who loved to see all sorts of games and shows. In order to make the city safer, he began to build a new and solid fortress in place of the old citadel. This fortress was sometimes called the Capitol, and hence the hill on which it stood was named the Capitoline. The king also gave orders that a great wall should be built all around the whole city of Rome. As this wall was not finished when Tarquin died, it had to be completed by the next king. The city was then so large that it covered all 7 of the hills of Rome: the Palatine, Capitoline, Quirinal, Celian, Aventine, Viminal, and Esquiline. Soon after Tarquin came to the throne, he increased the size of the army. He also decided that he would always be escorted by 12 men called lictors, each of whom carried a bundle of rods, in the center of which there was a sharp axe. The rods meant that those who disobeyed would be punished by a severe whipping, and the axes that criminals would have their heads cut off. During the reign of Tarquin, the augurs became bolder and bolder, and often said that the signs were against the things which the king wanted to do. This made Tarquin angry, and he was very anxious to get rid of the stubborn priests, for by pretending that they knew the will of the gods, they were really more powerful than he. The chief of these augurs, Attis Navius, was one of the most clever men of his time, and Tarquin knew that if he could only once prove him wrong, he would be able to disregard what any of them said. The king therefore sent for the augur one day, and asked him to decide whether the thing he was thinking about could be done or not. The augur consulted the usual signs, and after due thought answered that the thing could be done. "But," said Tarquin, drawing a razor and pebble out from under the wide folds of his mantle, "I was wondering whether I could cut this pebble in 2 with this razor." "Cut," said the augur boldly. We are told that Tarquin obeyed, and that, to his intense surprise, the razor divided the pebble as neatly and easily as if it had been a mere lump of clay. After this test of the augur's power, Tarquin no longer dared to oppose their decision, and although he was king, he did nothing without the sanction of the priests. End of chapter 15.
Chapter 16 of the Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of the Romans by H.A. Gerber. Chapter 16. The Murder of Tarquin. Tarquin was called upon to wage many wars during his reign. He once brought home a female prisoner whom he gave to his wife as a servant. This was nothing unusual, for Romans were in the habit of making slaves of their war prisoners, who were forced to spend the rest of their lives in serving their conquerors. Shortly after her arrival in Tarquin's home, this woman gave birth to a little boy, and Tanaquil, watching the babe one day, was surprised to see a flame hover over its head without doing any harm. Now Tanaquil was very superstitious, and fancied that she could tell the meaning of every sign that she saw. She at once exclaimed that she knew the child was born to greatness, and she adopted him as her own son, calling him Servius Tullius. The child of a slave thus grew up in the king's house, and when he had reached manhood, he married Tanaquil's daughter. This marriage greatly displeased the sons of Ancus Marcius. The young princes had hoped that they would be chosen kings as soon as Tarquin died, but they saw that Servius Tullius was always preferred to them. They now began to fear that he would inherit the throne, and they soon learned to hate him. To prevent Servius from ever being king, they resolved to get rid of Tarquin and take possession of the crown before their rival had any chance to get ahead of them. A murderer was hired to kill the king, and as soon as he had a good chance, he stole into the palace and struck Tarquin with a hatchet. As the murderer fled, Tarquin sank to the ground. But in spite of this sudden attempt to murder her husband, Tanaquil did not lose her presence of mind. She promptly had him placed upon a couch, where he died a few minutes later. Then she sent word to the Senate that Tarquin was only dangerously ill and wished Servius to govern in his stead until he was better. She managed so cleverly that no one suspected that the king was dead. The sons of Ancus Marcius fled from Rome when they heard that Tarquin was only wounded, and during their absence Servius Tullius ruled the Romans for more than a month. He was so wise and careful in all his dealings with the people that they elected him as the 6th king of Rome when they finally learned that Tarquin was dead. It was thus that the two wicked princes lost all right to the kingdom which they had tried to obtain by such a base crime as murder. End of chapter 16.
Chapter 17 of the Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kangaroo692. The Story of the Romans by H.A. GUERBER. The Ungrateful Children. Although Servius Tullius was the son of a slave, and had won the crown by a trick, he proved an excellent king. As he had once been poor himself, he was very thoughtful for the lower classes of Rome. He not only helped the poor to pay their debts, but also gave orders that some of the public land should be divided among the Sabines, so that they could support themselves by farming. Once a slave himself, he also took pity upon the hard life of the Roman slaves, and made laws in their favor. He even said that they should be set free if they served their masters faithfully for a certain length of time, or if they paid a sufficient sum of money. Slaves who had thus gained their liberty were called freedmen. Although they often stayed in their master's employ, they were no longer treated as slaves, but were paid for all they did. Little by little, the number of these freedmen grew greater, and slavery was no longer considered so terrible, since there was a chance of sometime being free. By order of Servius Tullius, all the Romans came together once in every 5 years on the field of Mars. Here they were carefully counted, and every man was called upon to give an exact account of his family and of his property. In this way the king knew just how many patricians, plebeians, freedmen, and slaves were to be found in Rome, and the process of thus counting people was called taking a census. Before the assembled Romans were allowed to leave the field of Mars and return to their homes, the priests held a religious ceremony to purify the whole state. This was called lustrum. As 5 years elapsed from one such ceremony to another, the Romans sometimes counted time by lustrums, just as we would use the word decade instead of 10 years. Servius would probably have made many more reforms in Rome had he not been forced to lay down the crown with his life, as you will soon see. Although he had no sons to succeed him, he had 2 grown-up daughters of very different dispositions. One of them was gentle and good, while the other was wicked and had a violent temper. Servius was anxious to settle both these daughters comfortably, so he gave them in marriage to the sons of Tarquin. These young men were also very different in character. One was so cruel and proud that he became to be called Tarquin the Haughty, or Tarquinius Superbus, in order to distinguish him from his father, Tarquin the Elder. To this prince Servius gave his gentle daughter. The wicked daughter, Tullia, was then provided with a good-natured husband, but she despised him on account of his kindly and gentle ways. Tullia and Tarquinius Superbus were so alike in character and tastes that they soon fell in love with each other and wished to marry. As they were both married already, it was very wicked for them to even think of such a thing, but they were so bad that they agreed to murder their gentle partners and then to become husband and wife. This plan was quickly carried out, and as one wicked deed leads to another, they were no sooner married than they began to plot a second crime. Both Tarquinius Superbus and Tullia, his wife, were very ambitious and anxious to occupy the throne, and they soon arranged to murder Suvius Tullius so that they might reign in his stead. According to the plan which they had made, Tarquin drove off to the Senate one day, and there, walking boldly up to Servius Tullius, he publicly claimed the crown. He said that he had the best right to it because he was the true heir of Tarquin the Elder. Servius paid no heed to this insolent demand, and Tarquin, seeing that his father-in-law did not move, suddenly caught him by the feet, dragged him from the throne, and flung him down the stairs into the street. This terrible fall stunned the king, and for a while everyone thought that he was killed. His friends were about to carry him away when he slowly opened his eyes. Tarquin, seeing that Servius was not dead, now gave orders to his servants to kill the king, and loudly proclaimed that anyone who ventured to interfere should die too. Frightened by this terrible threat, none of the Romans dared to move, and Servius was killed before their eyes. They did not even venture to touch the bleeding and lifeless body of their murdered king, but left it lying in the middle of the street. Then they obediently followed the cruel Tarquin into the Senate house, where he took place in his vacant throne as the 7th king of Rome. End of chapter 17. Recording by Kangaroo 692.
Chapter 18 of the Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of the Romans by H.A. Gerber. Chapter 18. The Mysterious Books. In the meanwhile, Tullia was anxiously awaiting news of her father's murder, and was wondering if anything had happened to spoil the plans which she had helped her husband to make. Too impatient to wait any longer, she finally ordered her servants to get her chariot ready and then drove off to find Tarquin. When the chariot had turned into the narrow street which led to the Senate, the driver suddenly pulled up his horses. Tullia then asked him why he did not go on. The man told her that he could not pass because the king's body lay across the street, but when she heard this, she haughtily bade him drive over it. We are told that the inhuman daughter was splashed with her father's blood when she appeared in the Senate to congratulate her wicked husband upon the success of their plan. This horrible act of cruelty was never forgotten in Rome, and the street where the murder took place was known as Wicked Street, and was always considered unlucky. The new king soon showed that he had a full right to the surname of Superbus, which meant insolent as well as haughty. When the people came to ask his permission to bury the dead king, he said, "Romulus, the founder of Rome, did without a funeral. Servius needs none." A man who did not scruple to commit murder in order to obtain the throne must have been very bad at heart, and Tarquin soon became extremely cruel in the way he governed the people of Rome. The poor were obliged to work day and night on the buildings which he wished to erect, and he treated many of the nobles so rudely that they left Rome and went to live in the neighboring city of Gabii. One of the principal edifices built by Tarquin at the cost of so much suffering to the poor was a temple for the service of the god Jupiter. It seems that as the builders were digging for the foundations, they suddenly came across a very well-preserved skull. As the Romans were very superstitious, they immediately sent for the augurs to tell them the hidden meaning of the discovery. After some thought, the augurs said it was a sign that the gods were going to make this place the head of the world. Now the Latin word for head is caput, and the Romans in later times thought that this was what gave its name to Capitol, as the temple of Jupiter was always called. This famous building stood on the Caudine hill, not far from the citadel of which you have already heard. Every year there was a great festival in which the Romans marched up the hill and went into the temple. There, in the presence of the people, one of the priests drove a nail into the wall to keep a record of the time which had passed since the building of the temple. Tarquinius Superbus had partly finished the Capitol, when he received a very strange visit. The Sibyl, or prophetess, who dwelt in a cave at Cumae, came to see him. She carried 9 rolls, or books, which she offered to sell him for 300 pieces of gold. Tarquin asked what the books contained, and she replied that it was prophecies about Rome. He wished to see them, but the Sibyl would not let him look at a single page until he had bought them. Now although the king knew she was a prophetess, he did not want to pay so much, and when he told the woman so, she went away in anger. Not long after, the Sibyl again visited Tarquin. This time she brought only 6 books, for which, however, she demanded the same price as for the 9. Tarquin, surprised, asked her what had become of the other volumes, and she answered shortly that they were burned. Tarquin again wanted to see the books, and was again refused even a glimpse into them. Then he found fault with the price, and again Sibyl grew angry, and went away with her 6 volumes. Although the king fancied that he would never see her again, she soon returned with only 3 volumes. She said that all the others were burned, and asked him 300 pieces of gold for those that were left. The king, awed by her manner, bought them without further ado. When the priests opened the mysterious volumes, they said that the prophecies concerning Rome were too wonderful for anyone but themselves to see. The books were therefore placed in a stone chest in the Capitol, where the priests guarded them night and day. From time to time, whenever any great trouble occurred, and the people did not know what to do, the augurs peeped into these volumes. Here they said they always found some good advice, but we now think that they pretended to read from the volume whatever they wished the Romans to do. End of chapter 18.
Chapter 19 of The Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sarah Hartman, Waltham, Massachusetts. The Story of the Romans by H.A. GUERBER, Chapter 19. Tarquin's Poppies. Tarquinius Superbus, the 7th king of Rome, was not only a builder, but also a great warrior. During his reign he made war against the Volscians, and he also besieged the city of Gabii, where the patricians who did not like him had taken refuge. This city was so favorably situated and so well fortified that Tarquin could not make himself master of it, although his army was unusually well trained. Seeing that he could not take it by force, he soon decided to try to win it by fraud. He therefore directed his son, Sextus Tarquinius, to go to Gabii and win admittance to the city by saying that the king had ill-treated him, and that he had come to ask protection. Sextus was as wicked as his father, so he did not scruple to tell this lie, and he set out immediately for Gabii. When the people heard the pitiful tale which Sextus told, they not only let him into their city, but also revealed to him their secrets. Then they made him general of their army, and even gave him the keys of the gates. Sextus was now all-powerful at Gabii, but he did not know exactly what to do next, so he sent a messenger to his father to tell him all that had happened and to ask his advice. The messenger found Tarquin in his garden, slowly walking up and down between the flower borders. He delivered all his messages, and then asked what reply he should carry back to Sextus at Gabii. Instead of answering the man, Tarquin slowly turned and walked down the garden path, striking off the heads of the tallest poppies with his staff. The messenger waited for a while in silence, and then again asked what answer he should take to his master. Tarquin came back to him, and carelessly said, "Go back to Gabii, and tell my son that I had no answer to send him, but be sure to tell him where you found me, and what I was doing." The man went back to Sextus and reported all he had seen. After thinking the matter over for a little while, Sextus understood why no verbal message had been sent. It was for fear that their plans would become known, and then he decided that his father, by striking off the heads of the tallest flowers, meant to advise him to get rid of the principal men in the city. This advice pleased the young prince, who now sought, and soon found, a pretext for getting rid of all the most prominent people of Gabii without arousing any suspicions. When all the bravest men had been either exiled or slain, there was no one left who dared to oppose him. Then Sextus opened the gates of the city and handed it over to the Romans. End of chapter 19.
Chapter 20 of the Story of the Romans. This is the LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of the Romans by H.A. Gerber. Chapter 20. The Oracle of Delphi. A wicked man is never really happy, and Tarquin, who had committed so many crimes, could not find much enjoyment in life. His conscience troubled him. His sleep was haunted by bad dreams, and he felt so restless that he did not know what to do. As the Romans believed that dreams were sent by their gods to warn them of the future, Tarquin was very anxious to have an explanation of the visions which disturbed his rest. He asked the Roman priests, but they failed to give him a satisfactory answer, so he decided to send to Delphi, in Greece, and to ask the noted oracle there to interpret these bad dreams. Now, as you may know, Delphi was a place in the mountains of Greece where there was a temple dedicated to the service of Apollo, god of the sun. In this temple lived a priestess called the Pythoness, who was supposed to converse with the gods, and to make their wishes known to all who consulted her. Any priest who did this was known as an oracle, and at the same time, the answers given out were also called oracles. Now, one of Tarquin's crimes was the murder of a nephew. His widowed sister, it seems, had two sons who were very rich. As the king wanted to get their money, he killed one of them and spared the other only because he thought him an idiot. In fact, the Romans used to say that this nephew's name, Brutus, was given him because of his brute-like stupidity. The young man, however, was only pretending to be stupid. He was really very intelligent, and was patiently waiting for a chance to avenge his brother's death. Tarquinius Superbus selected two of his own sons to carry his offerings to the temple of Delphi, and sent Brutus with them as an attendant. After giving the king's offerings and obtaining an oracle for him, the three young men resolved to question the Pythoness about their own future. Each gave a present to the priestess. The two princes offered rich gifts, but Brutus gave only the staff which he had used on the journey thither. Although this present seemed very mean, compared with the others, it was in reality much the most valuable because the staff was hollow and full of gold. The young men now asked the Pythoness the question which all three had agreed was the most important. This was the name of the next king of Rome. The priestess, who rarely answered a question directly, replied that he would rule who first kissed his mother on returning home. Tarquin's sons were much pleased by this answer, and each began to plan how to reach home quickly and be the first to kiss his mother. Brutus seemed quite indifferent, as usual, but thanks to his offering, the priestess gave him a hint about what he should do. Their mission thus satisfactorily ended, the three young men set out for Rome. When they landed upon their native soil, Brutus fell down upon his knees and kissed the earth, the mother of all mankind. Thus he obeyed the directions of the Pythoness without attracting the attention of the two princes. Intent upon their own hopes, the sons of Tarquin hurried home, kissed their mother at the same moment on either cheek. End of chapter 20.
Chapter 21 of the Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of the Romans by H. A. Gerber. Chapter 21. The Death of Lucretia. Tarquin was so cruel and tyrannical that he was both feared and disliked by the Romans. They would have been only too glad to get rid of him, but they were waiting for a leader and for a good opportunity. During the siege of a town called Ardea, the king's sons and their cousin, Calantinus, once began to quarrel about the merits of their wives. Each one boasted that his was the best, and to settle the dispute they agreed to leave the camp and visit the home of each, so as to see exactly how the women were employed during the absence of their husbands. Calantinus and the princes quickly galloped back to Rome, and all the houses were visited in turn. They found that the daughters-in-law of the king were idle and frivolous, for they were all at a banquet, but they saw Lucretia, the wife of Calantinus, spinning in the midst of her maidens and teaching them while she worked. This woman, so usefully employed, and such a model wife and housekeeper, was also very beautiful. When the princes saw her, they all said that Calantinus was right in their dispute, for his wife was the best of all the Roman women. Lucretia's beauty had made a deep impression upon one of the princes. This was Sextus Tarquinius, who had betrayed Gabii, and he slipped away from the camp one night and went to visit her. He waited till she was alone, so that there might be no one to protect her, and then he insulted her grossly, for he was as cowardly as he was wicked. Lucretia, as we have seen, was a good and pure woman, so, of course, she could neither tell a lie nor hide anything from her husband, which she thought he should know. She therefore sent a messenger to Calantinus and to her father, bidding them come to her quickly. Calantinus came, accompanied by his father-in-law and by Brutus, who had come with them because he suspected that something was wrong. Lucretia received them sadly, and, in answer to her husband's anxious questions, told him about the visit of Sextus and how he had insulted her. Her story ended. She added that she had no desire to live any longer, but preferred death to disgrace. Then, before anyone could stop her, Lucretia drew a dagger from the folds of her robe, plunged it into her heart, and sank dead at her husband's feet. Of course, you all know that self-murder is a terrible crime, and that no one has a right to take the life which God has given. But the Romans, on the contrary, believed that it was a far nobler thing to end their lives by violence than to suffer trouble or disgrace. Lucretia's action was therefore considered very brave by all the Romans, whose admiration was kindled by her virtues and greatly increased by her tragic death. Calantinus and Lucretia's father were at first speechless with horror, but Brutus, the supposed idiot, drew the bloody dagger from her breast. He swore that her death should be avenged, and that Rome should be freed from the tyranny of the wicked Tarquins, who were all unfit to reign. This oath was repeated by Calantinus and his father-in-law. By the advice of Brutus, Lucretia's dead body was laid on a bier and carried to the marketplace, where all might see her bleeding side. There Brutus told the assembled people that this young, beautiful woman had died on account of the wickedness of Sextus Tarquinius, and that he had sworn to avenge her. Excited by this speech, the people all cried out that they would help him, and they voted that the Tarquin family should be driven out of Rome. Next, they said that the name of the king should never be used again. When the news of the people's fury reached the ears of Tarquin, he fled to a town in Etruria. Sextus also tried to escape from his just punishment, but he went to Gabii, where the people rose up and put him to death. It was thus that the Roman monarchy ended, after 7 kings had occupied the throne. Their rule had lasted about 245 years, but although ancient Rome was for a long time the principal city in Europe, it was never under a king again. The exiled Tarquins, driven from the city, were forced to remain in Etruria, but Brutus, the man whom they had despised, remained at the head of affairs, and was given the title deliverer of the people, because he had freed the Romans from the tyranny of the Tarquins. End of chapter 21. Death of Lucretia. Recording by Grace Durant.
Chapter 22 of the Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of the Romans by H.A. Gerber. Chapter 22. The Stern Father. Although the Romans in anger had vowed that they would never have any more kings, they would willingly have let Brutus rule them. He was too good a citizen, however, to accept this post, so he told them that it would be wiser to give the authority to two men, called consuls, whom they could elect every year. This plan pleased the Romans greatly, and the government was called a republic because it was in the hands of the people themselves. The first election took place almost immediately, and Brutus and Collatinus were the first two consuls. The new rulers of Rome were very busy. Besides governing the people, they were obliged to raise an army to fight Tarquin, who was trying to get his throne back again. The first move of the exiled king was to send messengers to Rome, under the pretext of claiming his property. But the real object of these messengers was to bribe some of the people to help Tarquin recover his lost throne. Some of the Romans were so wicked that they preferred the rule of a bad king to that of an honest man like Brutus. Such men accepted the bribes and began to plan how to get Tarquin back into the city. They came together very often to discuss different plans, and among these traitors were two sons of Brutus. One day, they and their companions were making a plot to place the city again in Tarquin's hands. In their excitement, they began to talk aloud, paying no attention to a slave near the open door, who was busy sharpening knives. Although the slave seemed intent upon his work, he listened to what they said, and learned all their plans. When the conspirators were gone, the slave went to the consuls, told them all he had heard, and gave them the names of the men who were thus plotting the downfall of the Republic. When Brutus heard that his two sons were traitors, he was almost broken-hearted. But he was so stern and just that he made up his mind to treat them exactly as if they were strangers. So at once he sent his guards to arrest them, as well as the other conspirators. The young men were then brought before the consuls, tried, found guilty, and sentenced to the punishment of traitors, death. Throughout the whole trial, Brutus sat in his consul's chair, and, when it was ended, he sternly bade his sons speak and defend themselves if they were innocent. As the young men could not deny their guilt, they began to beg for mercy, but Brutus turned aside and sternly bade the lictors to do their duty. We are told that he himself witnessed the execution of his sons, and preferred to see them die rather than to have them live as traitors. The people now hated the Tarquins more than before, and made a law that their whole race should be banished forever. Collatinus, you know, was a most bitter enemy of the exiled king's family, but, as he was himself related to them, he had to give up his office and leave Rome. The people then chose another noble Roman named Valerius to be consul in his stead. When Tarquin heard that the Romans had found out what he wanted to do, and that he could expect no help from his former subjects, he persuaded the people of Veii to join him, and began a war against Rome. Tarquin's army was met by Brutus at the head of the Romans. Before the battle could begin, one of Tarquin's sons saw Brutus and rushed forward to kill him. Such was the hatred these two men bore each other, that they fought with the utmost fury, and fell at the same time, never to rise again. Although these two generals had been killed so soon, the fight was very fierce. The forces were so well matched that when evening came on, The battle was not decided, and neither side could call itself beaten. The body of Brutus was carried back to Rome and placed in the Forum, where all people crowded around it in tears. Such was the respect which the Romans felt for this great citizen, that the women wore mourning for him for a whole year, and his statue was placed in the Capitol among those of the Roman kings. The Roman children were often brought there to see it, and all learned to love and respect the stern-faced man with the drawn sword, for he had freed Rome from the tyranny of the kings, and had arranged for the government of the republic he had founded. End of chapter 22.
Chapter 23 of the Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ken Masters. The Story of the Romans by H. A. Gerber. Chapter 23. A Roman Triumph. As Brutus had died before the battle was even begun, the command of the Roman army had fallen to his fellow consul, Valerius, who was an able man. When the fight was over, the people were so well pleased with the efforts of their general that they said he should receive the honors of a triumph. As you have probably never yet heard of a triumph, and as you will see them often mentioned in this book, you should know just what they were, at least in later times. When a Roman general had won a victory or taken possession of a new province, the news was, of course, sent at once to the Senate at Rome. If the people were greatly pleased by it, the Senate decided that the victorious commander should be rewarded by a grand festival or triumph as soon as he returned to Rome. The day when such a general arrived was a public holiday, and the houses were hung with garlands. The Romans, who were extremely fond of processions and shows of all kinds, put on their festive attire and thronged the streets where the returning general was expected to pass. They all bore fragrant flowers which they strewed over the road. A noisy blast of trumpets heralded the coming of the victor, who rode in a magnificent gilded chariot drawn by 4 white horses. He wore a robe of royal purple, richly embroidered with gold, and fastened by jeweled clasps on his shoulder, and in his hand he held an ivory scepter. On the conqueror's head was a crown of laurel, the emblem of victory and the reward given to those who had served their country well. The chariot was surrounded by the lictors in festive array, bearing aloft their bundles of rod and glittering axes. In front of or behind the chariot walked the most noted prisoners of war, chained together like slaves, and escorted by armed soldiers. Then came a long train of soldiers carrying the spoil won in the campaign. Some bore gold and silver vases filled with money or precious stones, others pyramids of weapons taken from the bodies of their foes. These were followed by men carrying great signs, on which could be seen the names of the cities or countries which had been conquered. There were also servants carrying the pictures, statues, and fine furniture which the victor brought back to Rome. After the conqueror's chariot came the victorious army, whose arms had been polished with extra care for this festive occasion. The procession thus made its solemn entrance into the city, and wound slowly up the hill to the Capitol, where the general offered up a thanksgiving sacrifice to the gods. The victim on the occasion of a triumph was generally a handsome bull, with gilded horns, and decked with garlands of choice flowers. Servants were placed along the road, with the golden dishes in which they burned rare perfumes. These filled the air with their fragrance, and served as incense for the victor, as well as for the gods, whom he was thought to equal on that day. End of chapter 23. A Roman Triumph. Recording by Ken Masters. Chapter 24 of the Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ken Masters. The Story of the Romans by H.A. Gerber. Chapter 24. A Roman Triumph Continued. Of course, all the spectators cheered the victorious general when he thus marched through Rome in triumph, and they praised him so highly that there was some danger that his head would be turned by their flattery. To prevent his becoming too conceited, however, a wretched slave was perched on a high seat just behind him. This slave wore his usual rough clothes and was expected to bend down from time to time and whisper in the conqueror's ear, "Remember, you are nothing but a man." Then, too, a little bell was hung under the chariot in such a way that it tinkled all the time. This ringing was to remind the conqueror that he must always be good, or he would again hear it when he was led to prison or to gallows. For the passage of a criminal in Rome was always heralded by the sound of a bell. If the victory was not important enough to deserve a triumph, such as has just been described, the returning general sometimes received an ovation. This honor was something like a triumph, but was less magnificent, and the animal chosen as the victim for sacrifice was a sheep instead of a bull. The Roman who received an ovation came into the city on foot, wearing a crown of myrtle, and escorted by flute players and other musicians. The procession was much smaller than for a triumph, and the cheers of the people were less noisy. Now, you must not imagine that it was only the generals and consuls who were publicly honored for noble deeds. The Romans rewarded even the soldiers for acts of bravery. For instance, the first to scale the walls of a besieged city always received a crown representing a wall with its towers. This was well known as a mural crown, and was greatly prized. But the man who saved the life of a fellow citizen received a civic crown, or wreath of oak leaves, which was esteemed even more highly. All those who fought with particular bravery were not only praised by their superiors, but also received valuable presents, such as gold collars or armlets, or fine trappings for their horses. The soldiers always treasured these gifts carefully, and appeared with them on festive occasions. Then all their friends would admire them, and ask to hear again how they had been won. All soldiers tried very hard to win such gifts. They soon became the best fighters of the world, and are still praised for their great bravery. End of chapter 24. A Roman Triumph Continued. Recording by Ken Masters. Chapter 25 of the Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ken Masters. The Story of the Romans by H.A. Gerber. Chapter 25. The Defense of the Bridge. Valerius, as you have seen, received the honors of the first triumph which had ever been awarded by the Roman Republic. By the death of Brutus also, he was left to rule over the city alone. As he was very rich, he now began to build himself a new and beautiful house. The people of Rome had never seen so handsome a dwelling built for a private citizen, so they began to grow very uneasy, and began to whisper that perhaps Valerius was going to try to become king in his turn. These rumors finally came to the ears of the consul, and he hastened to reassure the people by telling them that he loved Rome too well to make any attempt to change its present system of government, which seemed to him very good indeed. Tarquin, as we have seen, had first gone to the people of Veii for help, but when he found that they were not strong enough to conquer the Romans, he began to look about him for another ally. As the most powerful man within reach was Porsena, king of Clusium, Tarquin sent a message to him to ask for his aid. Porsena was delighted to have an excuse for fighting the Romans, and, raising an army, he marched straight towards Rome. At his approach, the people fled, and the Senate soon saw that, unless a speedy attempt was made to check him, he would be in their city before they had finished their preparations for defense. The army was therefore sent out, but was soon driven back towards the Tiber. This river was spanned by a wooden bridge, which led right into Rome. The consul at once decided that the bridge must be sacrificed to save the city, and he called for volunteers to stand on the other side and keep Porsena's army at bay while the workmen were cutting it down. A brave Roman, called Horatius Cocles, or the One-Eyed, because he had already lost one eye in battle, was the first to step forward and offer his services, and 2 other men promptly followed him. These 3 soldiers took up their post in the narrow road, and the rest of the Romans hewed madly at the bridge. The 2 companions of Horatius, turning their heads, saw that the bridge was about to fall, so they darted across it, leaving him to face the armed host alone. But Horatius was too brave to flee, and in spite of the odds against him, he fought on until the bridge crashed down behind him. As soon as the bridge was gone, there was no way for the enemy to cross the river and enter Rome. Horatius therefore ceased to fight, and, plunging into the Tiber, swam bravely to the other side, where his fellow citizens received him with many shouts of joy. In reward for his bravery, they gave him a large farm, and erected a statue in his honor, which represented him as he stood alone near the falling bridge, keeping a whole army at bay. End of Chapter 25. The Defense of the Bridge. Recording by Ken Masters.
Chapter 26. The Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Firetech. The Story of the Romans by H.A. Gerber. Chapter 26. Hindered from marching into Rome as easily as he had expected, Porsena prepared to surround and besiege it. The prospect of a siege greatly frightened the people, for they had not much food in the city and feared the famine which would soon take place. The Romans were, therefore, placed on very short rations, but even so the famine soon came. All suffered from much hunger, all except for Horatius Cocles, for the starving Romans each set aside a small portion of their scanty food and bade him accept it. It was thus that they best showed their gratitude for the service he had done them, for they proved that they were brave enough to deny themselves in order to reward him. The Romans were still unwilling to surrender, but they feared that Porsena would not give up until he had taken possession of the city. Some of the young men, therefore, made up their minds to put an end to the war by murdering him. A plot was made to kill the king of Clusium by treachery, and Mucius, a young Roman, went to his camp in disguise. When Mucius came into the midst of the enemy, he did not dare ask any questions, lest they should suspect him. He was wandering around in search of Porsena, when all at once he saw a man so splendidly dressed that he was sure that it must be the king. Without waiting to make sure, he sprang forward and plunged his dagger into the man's heart. The man sank lifeless to the ground, but Mucius was caught and taken into the presence of Porsena. The king asked him who he was and why he had thus murdered one of his officers. Mucius stood proudly before him and answered, "I am a Roman, and meant to kill you, the enemy of my country." When Porsena heard these bold words, he was amazed, and threatened to punish Mucius for his attempt by burning him alive. But even this threat did not frighten the brave Roman. He proudly stepped forward and thrust his right hand into the fire that was blazing nearby. He held it there without flinching until it was burned to a crisp, and then he said, "Your fire has no terrors for me, nor for 300 of my companions, who have all sworn to murder you if you do not leave Rome." When Porsenna heard these words and saw the courage that Mucius displayed, he realized for the first time how hard it would be to conquer the Romans, and made up his mind to make peace. So he sent Mucius away without punishing him, for he admired the courage of the young man who loved his country so truly. Mucius returned to Rome, and there received the nickname Scaevola, or the left-handed. Soon after, Porsenna began to offer peace, and the Romans were only too glad to accept it, even though they had to give him part of their land and send some of their children into the camp as hostages. Porsenna treated these young people very kindly, but they soon grew homesick and longed to return home. One of the hostages, a beautiful girl named Cloelia, was so anxious to go back to Rome that she sprang upon a horse, plunged into the Tiber, and boldly swam across it. Then she rode proudly into the city, followed by several of her companions, whom she had persuaded to imitate her. The Romans were delighted to see their beloved children again, until they heard how they had escaped. Then they sadly told the hostages that they would have to return to Porsenna. Cloelia and her companions objected at first, but they finally consented to go back, when they understood that it would be dishonorable if the Romans failed to keep their promises they had made, even to an enemy. The king, who had witnessed their escape with astonishment, was even more amazed at their return. Full of admiration for Cloelia's pluck and for the honesty of the Romans, he gave the hostages full permission to go home, and left the country with all his army. End of chapter 26.
Chapter 27 of the Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of the Romans by H.A. Gerber. The Twin Gods. Tarquin had now made 2 unsuccessful attempts to recover the throne, but he was not yet entirely discouraged, and, raising a 3rd army, he again marched towards Rome. When the Senate and consuls heard of this new danger, they resolved to place all the authority in the hands of some one man who was clever enough to help them in this time of need. They therefore elected a new magistrate, called a dictator. He was to take command of the army in place of the consuls, and was to be absolute ruler of Rome. But he was to hold his office only as long as the city was in danger. The first dictator immediately took command of the army and went to meet Tarquin. The 2 forces came face to face near Lake Regulus, not very far from the city. Here a terrible battle was fought, and here the Romans won a glorious victory. Their writers have said that the twin gods Castor and Pollux came down upon the earth to help them, and were seen in the midst of the fray, mounted upon snow-white horses. When the fight was over, and the victory gained, these gods vanished from the battlefield, but shortly after, they came dashing into Rome and announced that the battle was won. Then they dismounted in the Forum, in the midst of the people, watered their horses at the fountain there, and suddenly vanished, after telling the Romans to build a temple in their honor. Full of gratitude for the help of the twin gods, without whom the battle would have been lost, the Romans built a temple dedicated to their service. This building was on one side of the Forum, on the very spot where the radiant youths had stood, and there its ruins can still be seen. The Romans were in the habit of calling upon these brothers to assist them in times of need, and in ancient tombs there have been found coins bearing the effigy of the 2 horsemen, each with a star over his head. The stars were placed there because the Romans believed that the twin gods had been changed into 2 very bright and beautiful stars. It is said that Tarquin managed to escape alive from the battle of Lake Regulus, and that he went to live at Cumae, where he died at a very advanced age. But he never again ventured to make war against the Romans, who had rooted him out so sorely. The old consul, Valerius, continued to serve his native city, and spent his money so lavishly in its behalf that he died very poor. Indeed, it is said that his funeral expenses had to be paid by the state, as he did not leave money enough even to provide for his burial. End of chapter 27. Recording by Grace Durant.
Chapter 28 of the Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of the Romans by H. A. Gerber. Chapter 28. The Wrongs of the Poor. Now that the war against Tarquin was over, the Romans fancied that they would be able to enjoy a little peace. They were greatly mistaken, however, for as soon as peace was made abroad, trouble began at home. There were, as you have already heard, two large classes of Roman citizens, the patricians, or nobles, and the plebeians, or common people. They remained distinct, generation after generation, because no one was allowed to marry outside his own class. The patricians alone had the right to be consuls and senators. They enjoyed many other privileges, and they owned most of the land. The plebeians, on the other hand, were given only a small share in the government, although they were called upon to pay a large part of the taxes. They suffered much from the patricians, who considered them not much better than slaves. Of course, this state of affairs was not made pleasant for the plebeians. Still, they remained very quiet, until matters grew much worse. As the plebeians were obliged to pay taxes, they had to have money, and when their farms did not yield enough, they were forced to borrow from the patricians. The patricians were always ready to lend money, because the laws were in their favour. Thus, if a plebeian could not pay his debts, the lender would seize the poor man's farm and even sell the man himself as a slave. The patricians were very cruel. They often kept the poor debtors in prison and beat and ill-treated them constantly. The plebeians were so indignant at all this that they finally rebelled, and when war broke out with the Volscians, they refused to go and fight. The consuls coaxed and threatened, but the plebeians would not stir. When asked why they would no longer go with the army, they answered that since the patricians claimed all the spoil taken in war, they might do all the fighting. To pacify the plebeians, the magistrates promised to make laws in their favour as soon as the war was over, if they would only fight as usual. So the men took up their arms and went to battle. But when the war was ended, the magistrates made no changes in favour of the plebeians, and allowed the patricians to ill-treat them as much as ever. The discontent had reached such a pitch that it was very evident some outbreak would soon take place. One day an unhappy debtor escaped from prison, and, rushing out into the forum, showed his bruises to the people and began to tell them his pitiful tale. He said that he was a plebeian, and that he had run into debt because, instead of cultivating his farm, he had been obliged to leave home and go with the army. Scarcely was one war over than another began, and at that time the Roman soldiers received no pay. Although he fought hard, and could show the scars of 20 battles, he had gained nothing for it at all except a little praise. Then, upon returning home, a patrician put him in prison, because he could not pay the money he owed. The debtor had been treated with the most horrible cruelty, and would probably have died there had he not succeeded in making his escape. Now there had been several cases like this, even before the war with the Volscians. This time, however, the plebeians were so indignant at the sight of the man's bruises, and at the hearing of his wrongs, that they all marched out of the city, vowing that they would never come back until they were sure of fair treatment. After leaving Rome, the plebeians camped upon a neighbouring hill, which was afterwards known as Sacred Mountain. When they were gone, the patricians, who had so ill-treated them, began to feel their absence. As the patricians scorned all work, and never did anything but fight, they were sorely taken aback when there were no farmers left to till their ground, no market-men to supply their tables, and no merchants from whom they could buy the articles they needed. The Senate saw that it was impossible to get along without the plebeians. One message after another was sent, imploring them to return, but the people said they had suffered enough, and would never trust in promises, since they would not be kept. End of chapter 28, The Wrongs of the Poor. recording by Harry Ramakrishnan from Bristol, England. Feel free to follow me at bhramakrishnan on Twitter and at harryramakrishnan.com.
Chapter 29 of the Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of the Romans by H. A. Gerber. Chapter 29. The Fable of the Stomach. Now although the plebeians were so obstinate in their refusal to return to Rome, and although they openly rejoiced when they heard that the patricians were in distress, they were nearly as badly off themselves. They had managed to bring only a very little food with them, and as they had no money, starvation was staring them in the face. Both parties were suffering, and no one knew how to put an end to this distressing state of affairs. At last, a wise Roman, named Menenius, offered to go and speak to the people and persuade them to come back to Rome. The senators, who had made so many vain efforts and had talked until they were tired, were delighted when they heard this offer, and bade Menenius go and do his best. This wise man, therefore, went to the sacred mountain, advanced into the midst of the crowd, and began to address them. He had noticed that the poor people, who were very ignorant indeed, did not understand the long speeches made by the senators, so he began to tell them a simple story. "My friends," said he, "all the different parts of the body once refused to work, saying that they were tired of serving the stomach. The legs said, 'What is the use of running about from morning till night, merely to find food enough to fill it?' 'We won't work for that lazy stomach either,' said the hands and arms. 'Legs, if you'll keep still, we won't move either.' 'We are tired, too,' said the teeth. 'It is grind, grind, grind all day long. The stomach can do its own work hereafter.' All the other parts of the body had some complaint to make about the stomach, and all agreed that they would not work any more to satisfy its wants. The legs ceased walking, the hands and arms stopped working, the teeth did not grind any more, and the empty stomach clamored in vain for its daily support of food. All the limbs were delighted at first with their rest, and when the empty stomach called for something to eat, they merely laughed. Their fun did not last very long, however, because the stomach, weak for want of food, soon ceased its cries. Then, after a while, the hands and arms and legs grew so weak that they could not move. All the body fell down and died, because the stomach, without food, could no longer supply it with strength to live. Now, my friends," continued Menenius, "this is just your case. The state is the body, the patricians are the stomach, and you are the limbs. Of course, if you refuse to work and remain idle, the patricians will suffer, just as the stomach did in the story I told you. But if you persist in your revolt, you will soon also suffer. You will lose your strength, and before long the body, our glorious Roman state, will perish." The plebeians listened to the story very attentively, understood the illustration, and saw the sense of all that Menenius said. They began to realize that they could not get along without the patricians any better than the patricians could get along without them. So, after talking the matter over a little, they all told Menenius that they were willing to go back to Rome. He was very glad when he heard this, and to prevent them from again being used so badly, he made the Senate give them officers who should look after their rights. These new magistrates were called tribunes. They had the right to interfere and change the decision of the consul, or any other officer, when it was necessary to protect a plebeian from ill treatment. If a man was in debt, therefore, the tribune could excuse him from going to war, and if the creditor was trying to make him a slave, the tribune could free him. In later times, also, the tribunes were given a place near the door of the Senate chamber. Before any new law could be put into effect, it had to be shown to them. In case they did not approve of the law, the tribunes could prevent it being adopted by saying veto, a Latin word which means, "I forbid it." This word is now used also in English, You will see in your United States histories that the President has the right of veto, or of forbidding the passage of any laws to which he objects. The tribunes were at first 2 in number, but later there were 10 of them. They were always the friends of the people. 2 other officers were also elected by the plebeians. They were called the aediles, and their duty was to help the tribunes, and also to care for the public buildings, to see that the Romans had clean houses and good food, and to look after the welfare of the poor people. Thus, you see, the plebeians were far better off than they had ever been before, and were now provided with magistrates whose sole business it was to look after their interests. End of chapter 29. The Fable of the Stomach. Recording by Grace Durant.
Chapter 30 of the Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of the Romans by H. A. Gerber. Chapter 30, The Story of Coriolanus. The plebeians returned to Rome as soon as they were sure that their rights would be respected. They had no sooner arrived, however, than they once more armed themselves and went out to fight the Volscians, who had taken advantage of the revolt to rise up against Rome. The victory was soon won, and the army came back to the city, where, in spite of the tribunes' efforts, new quarrels arose between the patricians and plebeians. One of the principal causes of discontent was that the patricians now regretted having given any rights to the plebeians, and were always seeking some good excuse to reduce them to their former state of subjugation. 3 years after the revolt of the plebeians, there was a great famine in Rome. The poor, as usual, suffered the most, and they were almost starved, when a king of Sicily took pity upon them and gave them a great quantity of wheat. The wheat was sent to the Senate, with a request that it should be divided among the suffering plebeians. Now, as you surely remember, none but the patricians were allowed to belong to the Senate, and they gladly took charge of the wheat. But instead of distributing it immediately, they kept it, saying that it would be given to the poor only on condition that they give up the right of electing tribunes and aediles. The plebeians were in despair. They were unwilling to lose their dearly won rights, and still they were so hungry that they could scarcely resist the temptation to do as the senators wished, for the sake of getting food for themselves and their families. They were very indignant that such a cruel advantage should be taken of their misery, and when they found that the plan had been suggested by a Roman named Coriolanus, they hated him. In their anger they loudly accused Coriolanus of treason, and made such fierce threats that the Senate did not dare to protect him. Coriolanus therefore fled from Rome, swearing that he would take his revenge, and he went to join the Volscians. The Volscians, you know, were the enemies of Rome. They had already made war against the proud city, and had lost part of their lands. They therefore received Coriolanus with joy, and gave him the command of their army, for they knew that he was an excellent warrior. Coriolanus then led them straight to Rome. On the way he won one victory after another over the Roman troops, and took village after village. Such was his success that the Romans began to fear for their city. The plebeians, moreover, heard that he was ravaging their lands and destroying all their property, while he did no harm to the farms of the patricians, and they began to tremble for their lives. When the victorious exile was only 5 miles away, a deputation of senators went out to meet him, and implored him to spare the city. But Coriolanus would not listen to their entreaties. He was equally deaf to the prayers of the priests and of the Vestal Virgins, who next came to beseech him to have mercy upon Rome. The Romans were in despair. They thought their last hour had come, but they made a final effort to disarm the anger of Coriolanus by sending his mother, wife, and children at the head of all the women in Rome to intercede for them. When the banished Coriolanus saw his mother, Veturia, and his wife, Volumnia, heading this procession, he ran forward to embrace them. Then the women all fell at his feet and begged him so fervently to spare their country that the tears came to his eyes. He would not yield, however, until his mother exclaimed, "My son, thou shalt enter Rome only over my dead body." These words almost broke his heart, for he was a good son and dearly loved Veturia. He could no longer resist her prayers, in spite of his oath and promises to the Volscians that he would make them masters of Rome. Bursting into tears, he cried, "Mother, thou hast saved Rome and lost thy son." The tears of the Roman women now gave way to cries of joy, and the procession returned in triumph to Rome. Only Veturia and Volumnia were sad, because Coriolanus could not accompany them, and because they could not forget his exclamation and feared for his life. When the women were gone, Coriolanus led his disappointed army home. Some historians say that he dwelt quietly among the Volscians until he died of old age, while others declare that they were so angry with him for betraying them and sparing Rome that they put him to death. According to a third version of the story, Coriolanus died of grief because he had left Rome and nearly caused her ruin, and because to save his native city he had been obliged to betray the Volscians who had trusted him. The spot where Veturia and Volumnia had knelt in tears before Coriolanus was considered as hallowed ground. Here the Romans built a temple dedicated to the fortune of women. They never forgot how generously Coriolanus had spared them when they were at his mercy, and when he died, all the women of the city were mourning for him, as they had worn it for Brutus. Thus, you see, even in those ancient times, the people knew that it was nobler to conquer one's own evil passions than to win a great victory, and that a man who is brave enough to own himself in the wrong and to do right is more worthy of honor than many another hero. End of Chapter 30. Recording by Joseph Schneblin of Kansas City, Missouri. Chapter 31 of the Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of the Romans by H. A. Gerber. Chapter 31. The Farmer Hero. The Romans were so warlike a people that they were hardly ever at peace. As soon as one battle was ended, they prepared for the next, and after defeating one people, they immediately tried their arms against another. When not busy making war abroad, they often quarreled at home, for, as you have already heard, the patricians and plebeians were too jealous of each other to agree for any length of time. In all this fighting, many soldiers were slain, and when the people of Veii once began to rise up against Rome, the Senate was dismayed to find that there was no army ready to meet them. In this time of danger, a noble patrician named Fabius stood up in the Senate and said that he and his family would at once arm and go forth and fight for the city. Early the next day, 306 men, all related to one another, and all bearing the name of Fabius, marched out of Rome to meet the foe. In the first battle the Fabii won a glorious victory, but later on in the campaign they were led into an ambush, and were all slain. When the news of their death was brought into the city, the people burst into tears, and the gate through which they had passed was called the Unlucky. The day of their death was marked in the Roman calendar as also unlucky, and the people publicly mourned the loss of such good and brave men, who had left only a few little children, too young to bear arms, for the defense of their country. The Romans, however, soon won a great victory over the people of Veii, and the two cities made a long truce. But the wars with other peoples still went on, and among the worst enemies of Rome were the Aequians. On one occasion the Roman troops were led by a consul who had not had much experience. Before long his camp was surrounded by the Aequians, and his army was in grave danger of suffering the same fate as the Fabii. 5 horsemen, however, managed to escape, and hurried to warn the Senate of the army's peril. The people were horrified at these tidings, and, knowing that the second consul was no more of a general than the first, insisted that a dictator should be chosen. Only one man seemed able to help them. This was Cincinnatus, an old soldier who had retired to a farm, where he spent all his time in plowing, sowing, and reaping. A party of senators went in search of him, and found him plowing in his fields. In haste they told him of the army's danger, and implored him to take charge of the city, and do all he could to save the lives of their brave countrymen. Cincinnatus was weary of warfare, and would have preferred to remain on his farm, but as soon as he heard the news, he left his oxen standing in the furrow, and went back to Rome with the senators. Arrived in the Forum, he called the citizens to arms. He bade every able-bodied man be on the field of Mars before sundown, fully armed, and carrying enough food to last him 5 days. The Romans were so glad to have a good leader that they hastened to obey him, and, as the sun sank beneath the horizon, Cincinnatus, the new dictator, marched out of Rome at the head of a little army of determined men. By walking all night, Cincinnatus brought his men in the rear of the Aequians, who at dawn found that the tables were turned, and that they were now between 2 armies of angry Romans. They soon saw that resistance would be useless, and, without striking a single blow, offered to surrender. Cincinnatus gladly accepted their offers of peace, but let them go only after they had given up their arms and spoil, and had gone through a ceremony called passing under the yoke. This was considered a great disgrace, and the Aequians would never have submitted to it had they not been compelled to do so in order to save their lives. The yoke was made by standing up 2 spears in the ground and tying a third across their tops. The Roman soldiers were drawn up in 2 long lines facing each other, and the enemy marched between them and under the yoke, a prey to the taunts and even to the blows of their conquerors. After thus rescuing the Roman army from certain death, Cincinnatus brought them back to the city and enjoyed the honors of a triumph. Then, seeing that his country no longer needed him, he laid aside the title of dictator, which he had borne for only a few days. Joyfully hastening back to his farm, he took up his ploughing where he had dropped it, and he went on living as quietly and simply as if he had never been called upon to serve as dictator, and to receive the honors of a grand triumph. This man is admired quite as much for his simplicity and contentment as for his ability and courage. He was greatly esteemed by the Romans, and in this country his memory has been honored by giving his name to the thriving city of Cincinnati. End of Chapter 31. Recording by Joseph Schneblin of Kansas City, Missouri.
Chapter 32 of The Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Johnny English. The Story of the Romans by H.A. Gerber. Chapter 32. The New Laws. It is much to be regretted that all the Romans were not as good and simple and unselfish as Cincinnatus, but the fact remains that there were many among them who thought only of themselves, and did not care what happened to the rest. The patricians in particular were much inclined to pride themselves upon their position and wealth, and to show themselves both haughty and cruel. As they oppressed their poorer neighbours, the plebeians grew more and more discontented, until the Senate saw that they would again rebel, if something were not quickly done to pacify them. There was now no Menenius to plead with the plebeians, and the senators remembered only too clearly how useless all their long speeches had been. To avoid an open outbreak, the senators therefore proposed to change the laws. In the first place, they sent 3 men to Athens, which was also a republic. Here they were to study the government, and to get a copy of the laws of Solon, which were the most famous in all the world. When the 3 men came home, they brought with them the laws of the Athenians, and of many other nations. 10 men were then elected to read them all, and choose the best for the new Roman code of laws. When adopted, the new laws were to be written upon brazen tablets, and set up in the Forum, so that all the people could read them whenever they pleased. The 10 men, or decemvirs as they were called, were granted full power for a year. They were very careful to be just in judging between the patricians and the plebeians, and they soon won the people's confidence and respect. The authority which they thus held pleased them so much that they wanted to keep it. At the end of the year, the laws were written on the brazen tablets and set up in the Forum, but the men pretended that their work was not yet done, and asked that decemvirs should be elected for a 2nd year. The people believed them, and the election took place. But only one of the 10 men, Appius Claudius, was chosen again. The new rulers were not as careful as the first. In fact, they were very proud and wicked, and soon began to act like tyrants. Strange to say, Appius Claudius was more unpleasant than all the rest. While he severely punished all the Romans who did not mind the laws, he paid no attention to these laws himself. He took whatever suited him, he did anything that he liked, and treated the people with great cruelty. One day, while sitting in the forum, he saw a beautiful girl, called Virginia, pass by on her way to school. She was so pretty that Appius took a fancy to her, and made up his mind to have her for his slave, although she was the daughter of a free Roman citizen. After making a few inquiries, he found that Virginius, the girl's father, was away at war. Thinking that Virginia would have no one to protect her, he called one of his clients, said that he wanted the girl, and gave the man the necessary directions to secure her. Now the clients at Rome were a kind of plebeians who belonged to certain families of patricians, and always worked for them. The client of Appius Claudius, therefore, promised to do exactly as he was told. When Virginia crossed the forum, on the next day, he caught her and claimed her as one of his slaves. The girl's uncle, however, sprang forward, and said that his niece was not a slave. He appealed to the law, and finally succeeded in having the girl set free, on condition that she should appear before Appius Claudius the next day, when the matter would be decided in court. Virginia's uncle knew that there was some plot to get possession of the beautiful girl entrusted to his care. Without losing a moment, therefore, he sent a message to her father, imploring him to come home and save his daughter from falling into the hands of wicked men. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of The Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Johnny English. The Story of the Romans by H. A. Gerber. Chapter 33. The Death of Virginia. The next day, at the appointed hour, the client appeared before Appius Claudius, and claimed Virginia as his property, saying that her mother had once been his slave. Now this was not true, and Virginia's uncle protested against such judgment, but Appius declared at once that the girl must go with the client. He said this because he had arranged that the man should give Virginia to him, and he fancied that no one would guess his motive or dare to resist. The client laid hands upon the unwilling Virginia, and was about to drag her away by force, when her unfortunate father appeared. Breathless with the haste he had made to reach Rome in time to save his child, he began to plead with Appius Claudius to set her free. He soon saw, however, that all his prayers were in vain, and that in spite of all he could say or do, his daughter would be taken away from him, and given over to the mercy of those wicked men. In his despair, he now asked that he might at least be allowed to take leave of Virginia, and he sadly led her to one side. He knew that none of the spectators would have the courage to help him save her, and that death was far better than the life which awaited her in the house of Appius Claudius. All at once he caught up a knife from a neighbouring butcher's shop, and stabbed her to the heart, saying, "Dear little daughter, only thus can I save you." Then, drawing the bloody dagger from her breast, he rushed through the guards, who did not dare to stop him, and left Rome, vowing that he would be avenged. When he reached the army, and told his companions about the base attempt of Appius Claudius, they all swore to help him, and marched towards Rome. The Decemvirs had not expected a revolt, and had made no preparations to defend the city. The army therefore marched in unhindered, and Appius was flung into prison. There he was found soon after, strangled to death, but no one ever took the trouble to inquire how this accident had happened. The Decemvirs were now entirely set aside, and the government was restored as it had been before, but the brazen tablets remained, and the laws which the tyrants had chosen continued to be enforced, because they were, in general, good and just for all the people. End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of the Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Johnny English. The Story of the Romans by H. A. Gerber. Chapter 34. The Plans of a Traitor. For some time the Roman state had been growing weaker, and as the quarrels at home increased, the Volscians and the Achaeans grew bolder and bolder. The patricians and plebeians were still at feud, and the Roman soldiers allowed themselves to be beaten rather than fight with all their might for a state which treated them so ill. The tribunes, hoping to mend matters a little, now asked that their plebeians should have the right to marry outside of their class, and to hold the office of consul. The first request was soon granted, but the second was for a long time denied. Both consuls were still elected from among the patricians, and the Senate also said that 2 new officers, called censors, should be of the same class. The duty of the censors was to count the people, to distribute the public lands fairly, to decide who should be senators, and to suppress all vice and wrongdoing of every kind. The plebeians, however, were given the right to hold some minor offices, and this, together with the law about marriages, satisfied them for the time being. They fought with a will, and conquered the Volscians. Everybody now hoped that the peace would be lasting, but the quarrelling soon began again. The main cause of this new outbreak was a famine, for when the hungry plebeians saw that the patricians were well supplied with food, they were naturally envious and dissatisfied. One of the rich patricians of Rome, Spurius Maelius, thought that this would be a good chance to win the affections of the people, and, in hopes of doing so, he began to give grain to them. He kept open house, invited everybody to come in and sit at table with him, and spent his money freely. Of course, all this seemed very generous, but Spurius Maelius had no real love for the people, and was treating them so kindly only because he wanted them to help him overthrow the government and become king of Rome. Many of the plebeians now ceased to work, as they preferred to live in idleness and on charity. People who do nothing are never very happy, and before long these plebeians were more discontented than ever, even though they now had plenty to eat. Spurius fancied that the right time had come, so he armed his followers, and prepared to take possession of Rome. Fortunately for the city, the plot was discovered by the Senate, who again chose Cincinnatus as dictator, to save the country from this new danger. This great patriot was then 80 years old, but he was as brave and decided as ever, and did not for a moment hesitate to do his duty. His first act was to send for Spurius Maelius, but, as he refused to obey the summons, the messenger of Cincinnatus stabbed him to death. The plebeians were now for more than 70 years obliged to content themselves with the rights that they had already won. In time, however, they were allowed to hold any office in the state, and it was made a law that at least 1 consul and 1 censor should always be of their class. Not long after the death of Spurius Maelius, war broke out with Veii again, and lasted for a number of years. The Romans finally decided that their city would never be safe till Veii was destroyed. This decision was received with enthusiasm, and the Roman army began the siege. They soon found, however, that it was no easy matter to make themselves masters of the town. 10 years were spent in vain attempts to break through the walls, and it was only when Camillus was made dictator that the Romans were able to take the city. Camillus made his men dig an underground passage right into the heart of the enemy's citadel. Having thus gained an entrance, he captured or slew all the inhabitants, and then razed the walls that had so long defended them. When he returned to Rome, he was rewarded by a magnificent triumph. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of The Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Johnny English. The Story of the Romans by H.A. Gerber. Chapter 35. The School Teacher Punished. The war with Veii was soon followed by one against the city of Phalerai, and here too the Roman army found it very hard to get possession of the town. One day, however, a schoolteacher came to Camillus, bringing his pupils, who were the sons of the principal inhabitants of Phalerai. Camillus was surprised to see the strange party coming from the city, but his surprise soon changed to indignation, for the faithless schoolmaster offered to give up the children confided to his care. He said that their parents would be quite ready to make peace on any terms as soon as they found that their sons were prisoners. Instead of accepting this proposal, Camillus sent the children back to their parents, and he gave each of them a whip, with directions to whip the dishonest schoolmaster back into the city. When the parents heard that their children owed their liberty to the generosity of the enemy, they were deeply touched. Instead of continuing the war, they offered to surrender, and Camillus not only accepted their terms, but made them allies of Rome. Thus a second war was ended by his efforts, and the Romans were again victorious. In spite of his successes abroad, Camillus was not a favourite at home. Shortly after his return from this last campaign, the Romans, who disliked him, accused him of having kept part of the spoil which had been taken at Veii. This accusation was false, but in spite of the protests of Camillus, they persisted in repeating it, and finally summoned him to appear before the magistrates, where he would be tried. This was very insulting, but Camillus would have complied had there been any hope of having an honest trial. As all those who were to judge him were his enemies, he refused to appear before the court, and preferred to leave his city and go off into exile. But when he passed out of the gates, he could not restrain his indignation. Raising his hands to heaven, he prayed that his countrymen might be punished for their ingratitude. This prayer was soon answered. Not long after Camillus had left Rome, the Gauls, a barbarous people from the north, came sweeping down into Italy, under the leadership of their chief, Brennus. These barbarians were tall and fierce. They robbed and killed with ruthless energy wherever they went, and, in spite of every obstacle, they swept onward like a devastating torrent. Before the Romans could take any steps to hinder it, they appeared before the city of Clusium, and laid siege to it. The Clusians were the friends and allies of the Romans, and the latter sent 3 ambassadors of the Fabian family to command the Gauls to retreat. Brennus received them scornfully, and paid no attention to their commands. Now it was the duty of the Fabii, as ambassadors, to return to Rome and remain neutral. Instead of this, the men sent a message to Rome, joined the Clusians, and began to fight against the Gauls. Although he was only a barbarian, Brennus was furious at this lack of fairness. In his anger he left the city of Clusium and started out for Rome, saying that he would make the Romans pay the penalty for the mistake of their ambassadors. End of chapter 35.
Chapter 36 of The Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ryan Cherrick. The Story of the Romans by H.A. Gerber. Chapter 36. The Invasion of the Gauls. A hastily collected army met Brennus near the river Allia, but in spite of the almost superhuman efforts of the Romans, the Gauls won a great victory, and killed nearly 40,000 men. The Roman army was cut to pieces, and no obstacle now prevented the barbarians from reaching Rome. As the Gauls advanced, the people fled, while many soldiers took refuge in the capital, resolved to hold out to the very last. The rest of the city was deserted, but 70 of the priests and senators remained at their posts, hoping that the sacrifice of their lives would disarm the anger of their gods and save their beloved city. These brave men put on their robes of state and sat in their ivory chairs on the forum to await the arrival of the barbarians. When the Gauls reached the city, they were amazed to find the gates wide open, the streets deserted, and the houses empty. They did not at first dare enter, lest they should be drawn into an ambush. but reassured by the silence, they finally ventured in. As they passed along the streets, they gazed with admiration at the beautiful buildings. At last, they came to the Forum, and here they again paused in wonder in front of those dignified old men, sitting silent and motionless in their chairs. The sight was so impressive that they were filled with awe, and began to ask whether these were living men or only statues. One of the Gauls, wishing to find out by sense of touch whether they were real, slowly stretched out his hand and stroked the beard of the priest nearest him. This rude touch was considered an insult by the Roman, so he raised his wand of office and struck the barbarian in the head. The spell of awe was broken. The Gaul was indignant at receiving a blow, however weak and harmless, and with one stroke of his sword he cut off the head of the offender. This was the signal for a general massacre. The priests and senators were all slain, and then the plundering began. When all the houses and temples had been ransacked, and their precious contents either carried off or destroyed, the barbarians set fire to the city, which was soon a mass of ruins. This fire took place in the year 390 BC, and in it perished many records of the early history of Rome. Because of their loss, not much reliable information was left, but the Romans little by little put together the history which you have heard in the preceding chapters. We now know that many of these stories cannot be true, and that the rest are not entirely so. And in this case also, with those in the next 2 or 3 chapters, for the first histories did not begin till many years after the burning of Rome. The Romans, however, believed thoroughly in all these stories, and people nowadays need to know them as much as they are perfectly true ones that follow. End of chapter 36. Recording by Ryan Sherrick.
Chapter 37 of the Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of the Romans by H.A. GUERBER. Chapter 37. The Sacred Geese. Rome was all destroyed except the capital, where the little army was entrenched behind the massive walls which had been built with such care by Tarquin. This fortress, as you may remember, was situated on the top of the Capitoline Hill, so that the Gauls could not easily become masters of it. Whenever they tried to scale the steep mountainside, the Romans showered arrows and stones down upon them, and day after day the Gauls remained in their camp at the foot of the Capitol, hoping to starve the Romans into surrender. The garrison understood that this was the plan which Bryennius had made, so to convince him that it was vain, they threw loaves of bread down into his camp. When the chief of the Gauls saw these strange missiles, he began to doubt the success of his plan, for if the Romans could use bread as stones, they were still far from the point of dying of hunger. One night, however, a sentinel in the Gallic camp saw a barefooted Roman soldier climbing noiselessly down the steep rock on which the Capitol was built. The man had gone to carry a message to the fugitives of Rome, asking them to come to the army's relief. The sentinel at once reported to Bryennius what he had seen, and the Gallic chief resolved to make a bold attempt to surprise the Romans on the next night. While the weary garrison were sound asleep, the Gauls silently scaled the rocks, following the course which the Roman soldier had taken in coming down. The barbarians were just climbing over the wall when an accidental clanking of their armor awoke the sacred geese which were kept in the Capitol. The startled fowl began cackling so loudly that they roused a Roman soldier named Manlius. As this man glanced towards the wall, he saw the tall form of a barbarian looming up against the sky. To spring forward and hurl the Gaul down headlong was but the work of a moment. The man, in falling, struck his companions, whose foothold was anything but secure, and all the Gauls rolled to the foot of the rock, as Manlius gave the alarm. All hope of surprising the Capitol was now at an end, so Bryennius offered to leave Rome, on condition that the Senate would give him 1,000 pounds of gold. This was a heavy price to pay for a ruined city, but the Romans agreed to give it. When they brought the precious metal and began to weigh it, they found that the barbarians had placed false weights in the scale, so as to obtain more gold than they were entitled to receive. The Romans complained, but Brennius, instead of listening to them, flung his sword also into the scale, saying scornfully, "Woe to the vanquished!" While the Romans stood there, hesitating, not knowing what to do, the exiled Camillus entered the city with an army, and came to their aid. When he heard the insolent demands of the barbarians, he bade the senators take back the gold, and proudly exclaimed, "Rome ransoms itself with the sword, not with gold." Next he challenged Brennius to a fight, and a battle soon took place, in which the Gauls were defeated with great slaughter, and driven out of the country. As soon as they were fairly gone, the fugitive Romans began to return, and many were the laments when they beheld their ruined homes. Instead of wasting time in useless tears, however, they soon set to work to rebuild their dwellings from the stones found in the ruins, and as each citizen placed his house wherever he pleased, the result was very irregular and unsightly. Manlius, the soldier who saved the capital from the barbarians, was rewarded by being given the surname of Capitolinus and a house and a pension. He was so proud of these honors, however, that he soon wanted to become king of Rome. He formed a plot to obtain possession of the city, but this was discovered before it could be carried out. Manlius Capitolinus was therefore accused of treachery and arrested. He was tried, found guilty, and sentenced to death. Like any other traitor, he was flung from the top of the Tarpeian rock, and thus he perished at the foot of the mountain which he had once saved from the assault of the Gauls. End of chapter 37, The Sacred Geese. Recording by Grace Durant.
Chapter 38 of The Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ryan Cherrick. The Story of the Romans by H.A. Gerber. Chapter 38. Two Heroes of Rome. Not very long after the departure of the Gauls and the tragic end of Manlius Capitonius, the Romans were terrified to see a great gap or chasm in the middle of the forum. This hole was so deep that the bottom could not be seen, and although the Romans made great efforts to fill it up, all their work seemed to be in vain. In their distress, the people went to consult their priests. As usual, and after many ceremonies, the augurs told them that the chasm would close only when the most precious thing in Rome had been cast into its depths. The women now flung in their trinkets and jewels, but the chasm remained as wide as ever. Finally, a young man named Curtius said that Rome's most precious possession was her heroic men, and, for the good of the city, he prepared to sacrifice himself. Clad in full armor and mounted upon a fiery steed, he rode gallantly into the forum. Then, in the presence of the assembled people, he drove the spurs deep into the horse's sides, and leaped into the chasm, which closed after him, swallowing him up forever. Now, while it was hardly probable that the story is at all true, the Romans always told it to their children, and Curtius was always held up as an example of great patriotism. The place where he was said to have vanished was swampy for a while, and it was named the Curtian Lake, and even after it had been drained it still bore this name. The same year that Curtius sacrificed himself for the good of the people, Camillus also died. He was regretted by all his fellow citizens, who called him the second founder of Rome, because he had encouraged the people to rebuild the city after the Gauls had burned it to the ground. Several great events were related by the Roman writers as having taken place at about this time, and among them is the fight between Valerius, a gigantic Gaul. It seems that this barbarian, who towered head and shoulders above everybody else, was in the habit of stepping out of the ranks and daily challenging the Romans to come and fight him. Afraid of meeting a warrior so much taller and stronger than they, the soldiers held back, but one of them, named Valerius, was so annoyed by the Gauls' taunts that he finally took up the challenge, and bravely made ready to fight. Although much smaller than his opponent, Valerius had one advantage, because he was helped by a tame raven, which he had trained to peck out an enemy's eyes. The Gaul fancied that he would win an easy victory over the small Roman, and boasted very freely, but before he had time to strike a blow, Valerius and the raven both attacked him. In trying to avoid the bird's beak, the Gaul fought to parry the blows of Valerius, and he soon fell to the ground dead. In memory of this duel with the Gaul, and of the help which he received from the tame bird, Valerius ever after bore the surname Corvus, which is the Latin word for raven. End of chapter 38. Recording by Ryan Cherrick. Chapter 39 of The Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ryan Cherrick. The Story of the Romans by H.A. Gerber. Chapter 39. The Disaster at the Caudine Forks. Valerius was not the only Roman who gained a name from meeting a Gaul in single combat. Another was a member of the Manilius family, to which, as you know, the savior of the capital belonged. Manilius, like Valerius, succeeded in killing his enemy, and, as a trophy, he took from the dead body the torque, or necklace, of twisted gold, which was generally worn by Gallic chiefs. Because he liked to appear with this ornament around his neck, the Romans surnamed him Torquatus, which means the man with the necklace. Torquatus in time was elected consul, and thus had command of the Roman troops. He thought that the soldiers were badly trained, and that the discipline was poor, so he made up his mind to reform the army. He therefore gave strict orders that every soldier should obey promptly, and added that he would put to death any man who ventured to rush into battle without waiting for the signal. Each Roman soldier was anxious to distinguish himself, and some of the men did not like this command. In the very next battle, the general's own son was so eager to begin the fight that he was the first to disobey the orders just given. Knowing that discipline must be maintained at any price, Torquatus sent for his son as soon as the fighting was over. Then, true to his promise, he had the offender executed in the presence of the whole army. The example of military justice so awed the Romans that none of them ever dared to disobey their general again. Order and discipline were restored, and the army returned to Rome victorious. There the Senate congratulated Torquatus, not only upon his success, but also upon the courage he had shown in keeping his word even at the sacrifice of his own son's life. The Senate never failed to compliment and reward a victorious general, but these same men always considered it a great disgrace when their army was defeated, and they often visited their displeasure upon its unlucky commander. Therefore, when Spurius Posthuminus, one of the consuls, fell into an ambush during a war with the Samnites, they were greatly displeased. The Romans were caught in a mountain defile, called the Caudine Forks, and being surrounded on all sides were forced to surrender. Then the whole army had to submit to the humiliation of passing under the yoke, and the council was made to promise that Rome would never renew the war. When Posthuminus came back to Rome, he was severely reproved by the senators, who were very angry indeed, because he had agreed to fight no more. In their wrath, they vowed that his promise to the Samnites should never be kept. Then Posthuminus told them that, since they disapproved of his conduct so greatly, they had better bind him hand and foot, and send him back to the Samnites. Strange to relate, the Senate took advantage of this generosity, and Posthuminus, bound like a criminal, was led to the Samnite camp. When the enemy heard that, although bound so securely, he had come there only by his own free will, they were struck with admiration for his courage. They knew that the Romans were going to continue the war, but they refused to take vengeance on Posthuminus, and sent him home unharmed. We are told that another Roman also showed great patriotism during the wars against the Samnites. This was the consul Decius, who overheard the augurs say that the victory would belong to the army whose commander was generous enough to sacrifice his life for the country's sake. As soon as the signal was given, therefore, Decius rushed into the very midst of the foe. Without attempting to strike a single blow, or to defend himself, he sank beneath the blows of the enemy. The soldiers, fired by the example of Decius, fought so bravely for their country's sake that they soon won a brilliant victory, and could return home in triumph. Many wars were thus waged by the Romans during the years which followed the visit of the Gauls. They took many towns, gradually extended the boundaries of the Roman state, and, after waging 3 wars against their principal foes, the Samnites, they hoped to have peace. The Samnites, who had thrice risen up against the Romans, were a powerful people, and were very brave. They lived in the country east and southeast of Latinum, and one of their principal towns was Herculaneum, about which you will hear some very interesting things a little later. End of chapter 39. Recording by Ryan Cherrick. Chapter 40 of The Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ryan Cherrick. The Story of the Romans by H.A. Gerber. Chapter 40. Pyrrhus and His Elephants. Although defeated in 3 separate wars, the Samnites were not entirely subdued. They knew, however, that they would never be able to conquer Rome alone, so they began to look about them for a very strong ally. South of their country and near the sea were several cities founded by Greek colonies, which had come there many years before. These cities were rich and thriving, and so powerful that their alliance was sought after by many of the Italian towns and tribes. One of the strongest of the Greek cities was Tarentum. Situated on what is now called the Gulf of Taranto, the Samnites therefore turned to the city for aid, and soon entered into an alliance with it. They knew that the people of Tarentum had earned most of their money by trading, and that they had a great many ships and cruised all about the Mediterranean Sea. Not long after the alliance had been formed between the Samnites and the Tarentians, the Romans complained that their vessels had been attacked by Tarentine sailors, and asked redress. The Greek city refused to apologize or to pay damages, so the quarrel between the 2 parties ended in a declaration of war. But the people of Tarentum did not feel strong enough, even with the aid of the Samnites, to meet the Roman army, and they asked for help from Epirus, a Greek country on the other side of the Adriatic Sea. Pyrrhus, the king of Epirus, was a brave man and a good general. His greatest ambition was to imitate Alexander the Great and to conquer the whole world. He therefore thought that this would be an excellent chance to begin, and sent a large army over to Italy. To complete the treaty of alliance with Tarentum, he also sent a man named Cineas, who was famous for his eloquence, and who was a pupil of the great orator Demosthenes. Pyrrhus himself soon came over to Italy, where he proudly viewed his force of 25,000 men, and his elephants, which were trained for fighting. Upon arriving in southern Italy, Pyrrhus gazed with contempt upon the Tarentians. He despised them because they hired soldiers to do their fighting for them. He spent all their days in eating and lounging, and in attending the baths and the theaters. Pyrrhus therefore told them that unless they hardened themselves by exercise, they would never be able to fight, and he ordered both baths and theaters to be closed. Next, he tried to drill them, and to make them as good warriors as his own soldiers, whom he formed into a phalanx, as the great Alexander of Macedon had done with his troops. Now, although the people of southern Italy were so weak and indolent, Pyrrhus knew that the Romans were foes worthy of him. He had often heard of their fighting, and he suspected that the Roman legions were a match for even the Macedonian phalanx. Both sides were therefore very anxious to win, and when the armies met at Heraclea, there was a terrible battle. The Romans had never seen any elephants before, and they were terrified when they heard these animals trumpet, and they saw them catch the soldiers up with their trunks, dash them down, and crush them under their huge feet. In spite of their fear, the Romans fought with the utmost valor, but they were finally forced to retreat. They lost 15,000 men on this disastrous day, and 1,800 were made prisoners. Pyrrhus won a victory, but he was obliged to pay for it very dearly, and lost so many soldiers that he was heard to exclaim, "One more victory like this, and I shall have to go home without any army." As he was the victor, he remained on the battlefield, and on the next day he walked all over it. The ground was strewn with the dead, but every Roman soldier had evidently perished from a wound in front, which proved that there was not a single coward among them. Pyrrhus was so struck with admiration at this circumstance, and at the sight of all those faces, which even in death bore the expression of stern resolve, that he exclaimed aloud, "Ah, how easily I could conquer the world, had I the Romans for soldiers, or, if they had me for a king." End of chapter 40. Recording by Ryan Cherrick. Chapter 41 of The Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ryan Cherrick. The Story of the Romans by H.A. Gerber. Chapter 41. The Elephants Routed. After such a murderous battle as that of Heraclea, Pyrrhus shrank from meeting the Romans again. In spite of all his bravery, he therefore sent the eloquent Cineas to Rome to try to make peace. But the fine speeches of the orator had no effect, and when Pyrrhus tried to bribe the senators to do as he wished, he found that this also was in vain. Fabricius, the Roman ambassador, came to his tent, and Pyrrhus tried to frighten him into submission by placing an elephant behind the drapery and making it trumpet all at once. Fabricius had never heard such a frightful sound in his life, and fancied that his last hour had come. But he remained firm in his refusal to make peace. Eloquence, bribery, and intimidation having all three failed, Pyrrhus again made ready to fight. The Romans, in the meanwhile, had collected another army. They were now accustomed to the sight of the fighting elephants, and their trumpeting no longer inspired them with fear. They met Pyrrhus once more at Asculum and were again defeated, but their loss was not so great as that of the enemy. The Romans were not ready to despair. In spite of their defeat, of course, they, one and all, hated Pyrrhus, yet they knew he was an honorable foe, and they would therefore meet him in a fair fight. So, when a doctor wrote to Fabricius, offering to poison his master, Pyrrhus, the honest Roman, was indignant. Instead of answering this treacherous letter, Fabricius sent it to Pyrrhus, bidding him beware lest the dishonest doctor should take his life. The warning, sent by an enemy, filled Pyrrhus with admiration for the Roman general's virtue, and he warmly cried, "It would be as easy to turn the sun from its course as thee from the path of honor, most noble Fabricius." Instead of continuing the war, Pyrrhus now sent back all the prisoners he had made, and offered a truce. This was accepted, and Pyrrhus passed over to Sicily, which he hoped to conquer more easily. But he was soon forced to return to Italy, and when he left the fertile island he regretfully said, "What a fine battlefield we are leaving here for Rome and Carthage." And, as you will see in the course of this story, this was true. On the return of Pyrrhus to Italy, a final encounter took place between him and the Roman army. Here the Romans pelted the fighting elephants with balls and rosin and flax, which they had set afire. The elephants, terrified by these missiles, and maddened with pain, turned to flee, trampling to death the soldiers of their own army. Then the Romans took advantage of the confusion, and, when the battle was over, Pyrrhus returned home to mourn the loss of 23,000 brave fighting men. His hopes of conquering Italy were ended, but, as he still wished to rival Alexander, he next tried to become master of Greece. While he was fighting in this country, however, his career was cut short. Once, when he was forcing his way through a city street, an old woman standing on the roof of her house dropped a tile on his head with such force that he was killed. The Tarentines, deserted by Pyrrhus yet unwilling to submit to Rome, began to look for another ally. The most powerful one they could find was Carthage, the city founded by Dido, so they sent there for aid. In spite of the Carthaginian vessels, however, the Romans soon became masters of Tarentum. The walls of the city were all torn down, but the inhabitants were spared, and were allowed to continue their commerce under the protection of Rome. The war was ended, and the army returned to Rome, where a magnificent triumph was awarded to the victorious consul. In the procession there were 4 of the fighting elephants which the Romans had captured, and all the people gazed in awe and wondered at their huge creatures, which they had then saw for the first time. End of chapter 41. Recording by Ryan Cherrick. Chapter 42 of The Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ryan Cherrick. The Story of the Romans by H.A. Gerber. Chapter 42. Ancient Ships. The ships in olden times were very different from many of those which you see now. They were not made to go by steam, but only by sails or by oars. As sails were useless unless the wind happened to blow in a favorable direction, the people preferred to use oars as a rule. Even large ships were rowed from one place to another by well-trained slaves, who sat on benches along either side of the vessel, and piled their oars slow or fast according to the orders of the rowing master. These vessels, with many rowers, were called galleys. When the men sat on 3 tiers of benches, handling oars of different lengths, the boat they manned was known as a trireme. There were other boats with 5, 10, or even 24 banks of oars, but for war the most useful were the triremes, or 3-banked ships, and the quinqueremes, or those with 5 tiers of rowers. For battle, the ships were provided with metal points or beaks, and a vessel thus armed was rowed full force against the side of an enemy's ship to cut it in two. Of all the people settled on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, the Carthaginians were now the best sailors. They dwelt at Carthage, in Africa, and, as their city was all the land they owned, they first turned all their energies to trading. The Carthaginians thus amassed great wealth, and their city, which was near the present Tunis, and was 23 miles around, was one of the finest in the world. In the course of their journeys, the Carthaginian sailors often visited Sicily, one of the most fertile countries in the world. Little by little they began to establish trading places there, and daily gained ground on the island. The Romans saw the advance of the Carthaginians with great displeasure, for it is but a step from Sicily to the Italian mainland, and they did not want so powerful a people for their neighbors. The city of Syracuse was at this time the largest and strongest on the island. Although the Carthaginians had waged many wars against it, there was also another city that was independent, which was occupied by a band of soldiers called the Myrmidines. A quarrel between these two cities led to war, and the Myrmidines were so badly defeated that they asked the Romans for help. When Hiero, the king of Syracuse, heard that Rome was planning to help his enemies, he sought aid from Carthage, and began to get ready for the coming war. The Romans, however, boldly crossed over into Sicily, and won such great victories that Hiero soon made peace with them, and he remained friendly to Rome as long as he lived. The Carthaginians were thus left to carry on the war without the help of Syracuse. Now, while the Roman legions were noted for their bravery on land, the Romans soon realized that Carthage would have the advantage because it had so many ships. A navy was needed to carry on the war with any hopes of success, and as the Romans had no vessels of war, they began right away to build some. A Carthaginian quinquereme wrecked on their shores was used as a model. While the shipbuilders were making the 120 galleys which were to compose the fleet, the future captains trained their crews of rowers by daily exercise on shore. Such was the energy of the Romans that in the short space of 2 months the fleet was ready. As the Romans were more experienced in hand-to-hand fighting than any other mode of warfare, each ship was furnished with grappling hooks, which would serve to hold the attacked vessel flat, and would permit the Roman soldiers to board it and kill the crew. The fleet was placed under the command of Duilius Nepos, who met the Carthaginian vessels near Melae, off the coast of Sicily, and defeated them completely. Most of the enemy's ships were taken or sunk, and, when Duilius returned to Rome, the Senate awarded him the first naval triumph. In the procession, the conqueror was followed by his sailors, bearing the bronze beaks of the Carthaginian galleys for which they had taken. These beaks, called rostra, were afterwards placed on a column in the forum near the orator's stand, which was known as the rostra, because it was already adorned by similar beaks of ships. Duilius was further honored by an escort of flute players and torch-bearers who accompanied him home from every banquet he attended. As no one else could boast of such an escort, this was considered a great privilege. End of Chapter 42. Recording by Ryan Cherrick. Chapter 43 of The Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ryan Cherrick. The Story of the Romans by H.A. Gerber. Chapter 43. Regulus and the Snake. The war against Carthage lasted many years, with sundry interruptions. The Carthaginians made many promises to the Romans, but broke them so often that Punic faith, that is, Carthaginian faith, came to mean the same as treachery or deceit. When both parties were weary of the long struggle, the Romans resolved to end it by carrying the war into Africa. An army was therefore sent out under the command of Regulus. The men landed in Africa, where a new and terrible experience awaited them. One day, shortly after their arrival, the camp was thrown into a panic by the appearance of one of the monster snakes for which Africa is noted, but which the Romans had never seen. The men fled in terror, and the serpent might have routed the whole army, had it not been for their leader's presence of mind. Instead of fleeing with the rest, Regulus bravely stood his ground, and called to his men to bring one of the heavy machines with which they intended to throw stones into Carthage. He saw at once that with a ballista, or catapult as these machines were called, they could stone the snake to death without much risk to themselves. Reassured by his words and example, the men obeyed, and went to work with such goodwill that the snake was soon slain. Its skin was kept as a trophy of this adventure, and sent to Rome, where the people gazed upon it in wonder, for we are told that the monster was 120 feet long. Judging by this account, the snake story is very old indeed, and the Romans evidently knew how to exaggerate. Having disposed of the snake, the Roman army now proceeded to war against the Carthaginians. These had the larger army and many fighting elephants, so the Romans were at last completely defeated, and Regulus was made prisoner and taken into Carthage in irons. The Carthaginians had won this great victory under a Greek general named Xanthippus, to whom, of course, the people were very grateful, but it is said that they forgot his services, and ended by drowning him. The rulers of Carthage soon had cause to regret the loss of Xanthippus, for the Romans, having raised a new army, won several victories in Sicily and drove the Carthaginian commander Hasdrubal out of the island. As you have already seen, the people in those days rewarded their generals when successful, but when a battle was lost, they were apt to consider the general as a criminal, and to punish him for being unlucky by disgrace or death. So when Hasdrubal returned to Carthage defeated, the people all felt indignant and condemned him to die. Then the Carthaginians, weary of war which had already lasted about 15 years, sent an embassy to Rome to propose peace, but their offers were refused. About this time Regulus was killed in Carthage, and in later times the Romans told a story of him which you will often hear. They said that the Carthaginians sent Regulus along with the embassy, after making him promise to come back to Carthage if peace were not declared. They did this by thinking that, in order to secure his freedom, he would advise the Romans to stop the war. Regulus, however, was too good a patriot to seek his own welfare in preference to that of his country. When asked his advice by the Roman Senate, he bade them continue the fight, and then, although they tried to detain him in Rome, he insisted upon keeping his promise and returning to captivity. When he arrived in Carthage with the embassy, and it became known that he had advised the continuation of the war, the people were furious and put him to death without frightful tortures. The war went on for 7 or 8 years more, until even the Romans longed for peace. A truce was then made between Rome and Carthage, which put an end to the greatest war the Romans had yet waged, the struggle which is known in history as the First Punic War. End of Chapter 43. Recording by Ryan Cherrick. Chapter 44 of the Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ryan Cherrick. The Story of the Romans by H.A. Gerber. Chapter 44. Hannibal crosses the Alps. The peace won thus after years of fighting was very welcome, and the Romans gladly closed the temple of Janus for the first time since the days of Numa Pompilius, the second king of Rome. As there was no fighting to be done anywhere, the people now began to cultivate the arts of peace. For the first time in their busy lives, they took a deep interest in poetry and enjoyed satires, tragedies, and comedies. But while the first style of poetry was an invention of their own, they borrowed the others from the Greeks. As they knew that an inactive life would not please them long, they made sundry improvements in their arms and defences, and prepared for future wars. Then, to prevent their weapons from rusting, they joined the Achaeans in making war against the pirates who infested the Adriatic Sea. Soon after this, the Gauls again invaded Italy, and came down into Etruria. Within 3 days, much of Rome. The citizens flew to arms to check their advance, and defeated them in a pitched battle. 40,000 of the barbarians were killed, and 10,000 were made prisoners. In a second encounter, the king of the Gauls was slain, and the people bought peace from the victorious Romans by giving up to them all the land which they had occupied in the northern part of Italy. While Rome was thus busy making many conquests, the Carthaginians had not been idle either. In a very short time, their trade was as brisk as ever, and they conquered about half of Spain. Then, as soon as they earned enough money and finished their preparations, they broke the treaty they had made with Rome by besieging Saguntum, a Spanish city under the protection of the Romans. The Roman Senate sent an ambassador to Carthage to complain of this breach of the treaty, and to ask that the general who had taken Saguntum should be given up to them. This general was Hannibal, a man who hated the Romans even more than he loved his own country. When only a little boy, he had taken a solemn oath upon the altar of one of the Carthaginian gods that he would fight Rome as long as he lived. Hannibal was a born leader, and his dignity, endurance, and presence of mind made him one of the most famous generals of ancient times. The Carthaginians had not yet much chance to try his skill, but they were not at all ready to give him up. When the Roman ambassador, Fabius, saw this, he strode into their assembly with his Rome drawn together, as if concealed some hidden object. "Here I bring you peace or war," he said. "Choose." The Carthaginians, nothing daunted by his proud bearing, coolly answered, "Choose yourself." "Then it is war," replied Fabius, and he at once turned away and went back to Rome to make known the result of his mission. Hannibal, in the meanwhile, continued the war in Spain, and when he had forced his way through the north of the country, he led his army of more than 50,000 men over the Pyrenees and across Gaul. His object was to enter Italy by the north, and carry on the war there instead of elsewhere. Although it was almost winter, and the huge barrier of the Alps rose before him, he urged his men onward. The undertaking seemed impossible, and would never have been attempted by a less determined man. Thanks to Hannibal's coolness and energy, however, the army wound steadily upward along the precipices and through the snow. Although over half of the men perished from the cold, or from the attacks of the hostile inhabitants, the remainder came at last to the Italian plains. It had taken a whole fortnight to cross the Alps. End of chapter 44. Recording by Ryan Cherrick. Chapter 45 of The Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ryan Cherrick. The Story of the Romans by H. A. Gerber. Chapter 45. The Romans Defeated. When the Romans heard of Hannibal's approach, the consul Scipio advanced with an army to fight him, and the two forces met face to face near the river Tynetius. Here a battle took place, and Hannibal, reinforced by Gallic troops, won a brilliant victory. A second battle was fought and won by stratagem at the river of Trebia, where a frightful slaughter of the Romans took place. Beaten back twice, the Romans rallied again, only to meet with a still greater defeat on the shores of Lake Trasimene. In the distress at the news of these repeated disasters, the Roman people gave the command of their army to Fabius, a man noted for his courage no less than for his caution. Fabius soon perceived that the Romans were not able to conquer Hannibal in pitched battle, and, instead of meeting him openly, he skirmished around him, cutting off his supplies and hindering his advance. On one occasion, by seizing a mountain pass, Fabius even managed to hedge the Carthaginians in, and fancied that he could keep them prisoners and starve them into submission. But Hannibal soon made his escape. By his order, the oxen which went with the army to supply it with food and to drag the baggage were all gathered together. Torches were fastened securely to their horns and then lighted. Blinded and terrified, the oxen stampeded and rushed right through the Roman troops, who were forced to give way so as not to be crushed to death. The Carthaginians then cleverly took advantage of the confusion and darkness to make their way out of the dangerous position and thus escaped in safety. Fabius was now obliged to share his command with another general, who did not like his plan of avoiding an open battle. This general advanced against Hannibal and began to fight, but he would have had paid dearly for his imprudence had not Fabius come to his rescue just in time to save him. By pursuing these cautious tactics, which have since been often called the Fabian policy, Fabius prevented Hannibal from gaining any great advantage. But when his time of office was ended, his successors, the consuls Varro and Emulus, thinking they would act more wisely and in the war, again ventured to fight the Carthaginians. The battle took place at Cannae, and the Romans were again defeated, with very great loss. Emulus fell, but not till he had sent a last message to Rome, bidding the people straighten their fortifications, and acknowledge that it would have been far wiser to have pursued the Fabian policy. So many Romans were slain on this fatal day at Cannae, that Hannibal is said to have sent to Carthage 1 peck of gold rings, taken from the fingers of dead knights, who alone wore them. When the tidings of the defeat came to Rome, the sorrowing people began to fear that Hannibal would march against them while they were defenseless, and that he would thus become master of the city. In their terror, they again appealed to Fabius, who soon restored courage and order, called all the citizens to arms, and drilled even the slaves to fight. Hannibal, in the meanwhile, had gone to Capua, where he wished to spend the winter, and give his men a chance to recruit after their long journey of great fatigues. The climate was so delightful, the food so plentiful, and the hot baths so inviting, that many of the Carthaginians grew fat and lazy, and before they had spent many months there, they were no longer able to fight well. Ever since then, when people think too much of ease and not enough of duty, they are said to be languishing in the delights of Capua. End of chapter 45. Recording by Ryan Jarek. Chapter 46 of The Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ryan Jarek. The Story of the Romans by H.A. Gerber. Chapter 46. The Inventor Archimedes. Hero, king of Syracuse, died shortly after the Battle of Cannae. He had helped the Romans much, but his successors soon made an alliance with the Carthaginians and declared war against Rome. The Romans, however, had taken new courage from the welcome news that Hannibal had decided upon going to Capua instead of marching straight on to Rome. As soon as some of the new troops could be spared, therefore, they were sent over to Sicily under the command of Marcellus, with orders to besiege Syracuse. This was a very great undertaking, for the city was strongly fortified, and within its walls was Archimedes, one of the most famous mathematicians and inventors that have ever been known. He had discovered that even the heaviest weights could be handled with ease by means of pulleys and levers, and he is said to have exclaimed, "Give me a long enough lever and a spot whereupon to rest it, and I will lift the world." Archimedes made use of his great talents to invent all sorts of war engines. He taught the Syracusans how to fashion stone catapults of great power, and large grappling hooks which swung over the sea, caught the enemy's vessels, and overturned them in the water. He is also said to have devised a very clever arrangement of mirrors and burning glasses, by means of which he could set fire to the Roman ships. To prevent the Syracusan ships from sinking when they had water in their holds, he invented a water screw which could be used for a pump. Thanks to the skill of Archimedes, the Syracusans managed to hold out very long, but finally the Romans forced their way into the town. They were so angry with the people for holding out so long they plundered the whole city, and killed many of the inhabitants. A Roman soldier rushed into the house where Archimedes was sitting, so absorbed in his calculations that he was not even aware the city had been taken. The soldier, not knowing who the student was, killed Archimedes as he was sitting in front of a table loaded with papers. Marcellus, the Roman general, had given orders that the inventor should be spared, and was very sorry to hear that he was dead. To do Archimedes honor, he ordered a fine funeral, which was attended by Romans and Syracusans alike. In the meanwhile, Hannibal was beginning to lose ground in Italy, and the Carthaginians, who were left in Spain, had been obliged to fight many battles. Their leader was Hasdrubal, the brother of Hannibal, while the Romans were commanded by the two Scipios. These two generals were at last both unlucky, but their successor, another Scipio, defeated the Carthaginians so many times that the whole country became, at last, a Roman province. Escaping from Spain, Hasdrubal prepared to follow the road his brother had taken, and so joined him in southern Italy. He never reached Hannibal, however, for after crossing the Alps he was attacked and slain, with all his army. The Romans who won this great victory then hastened south and threw Hasdrubal's head into his brother's camp, and this was the first news that Hannibal had of the great disaster. All the luck in the beginning of this war had been on the side of the Carthaginians, but fortune had now forsaken them completely, and Hannibal, after meeting with another defeat, went back with his army to Carthage, because he heard that Scipio had come from Spain to besiege the city. The country to the west of Carthage, called Numidia, was at the time mostly divided between two rival kings. One of them, Massena, sent his soldiers to help Scipio as soon as he crossed over to Africa, and the Romans could not but admire the fine horsemanship of these men. They were the ancestors of the Berbers, who live in the same region today and are still fine riders. Syphax, the rival of Massena, joined the Carthaginians, who promised to make him king of all Numidia if they succeeded in winning the victory over their enemies. With their help, he fought 3 great battles against the Romans, but in each one he was badly defeated, and in the last he was made prisoner. After Hannibal came, he soon met the invaders near Zama, and a great battle was fought, in which Scipio and Massena gained the victory. In their despair, the Carthaginians proposed to make peace. The Romans consented, and the Second Punic War was ended, after it had raged about 17 years. On his return to Rome, Scipio was honored by receiving the surname Africanus, and by a grand triumph in which Syphax followed in his car, chained like a slave. But although the Romans cheered Scipio widely and lavished praises upon him, they soon accused him of having wrongfully taken possession of some of the gold he had won during his campaigns. This base accusation was brought soon after Scipio had helped to win some great victories in Asia, of which you will soon hear, and it made him so angry that he left Rome forever. He withdrew to his country house in Campania, a part of Italy to the southeast of Rome. Here he remained as long as he lived, and when he died he left orders that his bones should not rest in a city which had proved so ungrateful as Rome. End of chapter 46. Recording by Ryan Cherrick. Chapter 47 of The Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ryan Cherrick. The Story of the Romans by H.A. Gerber. Chapter 47. The Roman Conquests. You might think that the Romans had all they could do to fight the Carthaginians in Spain, Italy, and Africa. But even while the Second Punic War was still raging, they were also obliged to fight Philip V, king of Macedon. As soon as the struggle with Carthage was ended, the war with Philip was begun again in earnest. The army was finally placed under the command of Flaminius, who defeated Philip and compelled him to ask for peace. And then he told the Greeks, who had long been oppressed by the Macedonians, that they were free from further tyranny. This announcement was made by Flaminius himself at the celebration of the Isthmian Games, and when the Greeks heard that they were free, they sent up such mighty shouts of joy that it is said that a flock of birds fell down to the earth, quite stunned. To have triumphed over the Carthaginians and Macedonians was not enough for the Romans. They had won much land by these wars, but were now longing to get more. They therefore soon began to fight against Antiochus, king of Syria, who had been the ally of the Macedonians, and now threatened the Greeks. Although Antiochus was not a great warrior himself, he had at his court one of the greatest generals of the ancient world. This was Hannibal, whom the Carthaginians had exiled, and while he stayed there he once met his conqueror, Scipio, and the two generals had many talks together. On one occasion, Scipio is said to have asked Hannibal who was the greatest general the world had ever seen. "Alexander," promptly answered Hannibal. "Whom do you rank next?" continued Scipio. "Pyrrhus." "And after Pyrrhus?" "Myself," said the Carthaginian proudly. "Where would you have placed yourself if you had conquered me?" asked Scipio. "Above Pyrrhus and Alexander and all the other generals," Hannibal exclaimed. If Antiochus had followed Hannibal's advice, he might perhaps have conquered the Romans, but although he had much greater army than theirs, he was soon driven out of Greece, and defeated in Asia on land and sea by another Scipio, a brother of Africanus, who thus won the title of Aegiticus. Then the Romans forced Antiochus to give up all his land in Asia Minor northwest of the Taurus Mountains, and he also made him agree to surrender his guest Hannibal. He did not keep this promise, however, for Hannibal had fled to Bithynia, where, finding that he could no longer escape from his lifelong enemies, he killed himself by swallowing the poison contained in a little hollow in a ring which he always wore. The Romans allowed Philip to keep the crown of Macedon on condition that he should obey them. He did so, but his successor, Perseus, hated the Romans and made a last desperate effort to regain his freedom. The attempt was vain, however, and he was finally and completely defeated at Padilla. Perseus was then made prisoner and carried off to Italy. To grace of the Roman general triumph, and Macedon, or Macedonia, the most powerful country in the world under the rule of Alexander, was reduced to the rank of a Roman province after a few more vain attempts to recover its independence. End of chapter 47. Recording by Ryan Cherrick. Chapter 48 of The Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ryan Cherrick. The Story of the Romans by H.A. Gerber. Chapter 48. Destruction of Carthage. While Rome was thus little extending its powers in the east, the Carthaginians were slowly recovering from the Second Punic War, which had proved so disastrous for them. The Romans, in the meanwhile, felt no great anxiety about Carthage, because their ally, Massinissa, was still king in Numidia, and was expected to keep the Senate informed of all that was happening in Africa. But after the peace had lasted about 50 years, and Carthage had got over her losses, and again amassed much wealth, some of the Romans felt quite sure that the time would come when the contest would be renewed. Others, however, kept saying that Carthage should be entirely crushed before she managed to get strength enough to fight. One man in Rome was so much in favor of the latter plan that he spoke of it on every opportunity. This was Cato, the censor, a stern and proud old man who ended every one of his speeches made before the Senate by saying Carthage must be destroyed. He repeated these words so often and so persistently that by and by the Romans began to think as he did, and they were not all sorry when the king of Numidia broke the peace and began what is known in history as the Third Punic War. The Carthaginians, worsted in the first encounter, were very anxious to secure peace. Indeed, they were so anxious that they once gave up all their arms at the request of Rome, but after making them give up nearly all they owned, the Romans finally ordered them to leave their beautiful city so that it could be destroyed, and this they refused to do. As peace was not possible, the Carthaginians then made up their minds to fight bravely, and to sell their liberty only with their lives. Their arms having been taken away from them, all the metal in town was collected for new weapons. Such was the love of the people for their city that the inhabitants gave all their silver and gold for its defense, to make the walls stronger. Not content with giving up their jewelry, the Carthaginian women cut off their long hair to make ropes and bowstrings, and went out with the oldest children to work at the fortifications, which were to be strengthened to resist the coming attack. Every child old enough to walk, fired by the example all around him, managed to carry a stone or sod to help in the work of the defense. The siege began, and under the conduct of Hasdrubal, their general, the Carthaginians held out so bravely that at the end of 5 years Carthage was still free. The Romans, under various commanders, vainly tried to surprise the city, but it was only when Scipio Aemilianus broke down the harbor wall that his army managed to enter Carthage. The Romans were so angry at long resistance of their enemies, they slew many of the men, made all the women captives, pillaged the town, and then set fire to it. Next, the mighty walls were raised, and Carthage, the proud city which had rivaled Rome for more than 100 years, was entirely destroyed. Thus ended the third and last Punic War, and the heroic defense of the city which the Romans had always feared, and which they would not allow to stand lest it should some day become powerful enough to rule them. That same year, after secretly encouraging all the Greek cities to quarrel among themselves, the Romans went over to Greece, and soon made themselves masters of the whole country. They destroyed Corinth in the same way as Carthage, and bore away from it countless treasures of art, which they were yet too ignorant to appreciate. Not long afterwards, a third town shared the terrible fate of Carthage and Corinth. This was Numantia in Spain, whose walls were successfully defended against the Romans until supplies failed, and many of the inhabitants had starved to death. Too weak to fight any longer, the remainder saw their town leveled to the ground, and were then sold into slavery. End of chapter 48. Recording by Ryan Cherrick. Chapter 49 of the Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ryan Cherrick. The Story of the Romans by H.A. Gerber. Chapter 49. Roman Amusements. The Romans by this time had entirely forgotten their old simple ways. As their lands increased with each new victory, so did their wealth and their pride. Instead of comprising only the city on the 7 hills and a few neighboring villages, the Roman Republic now extended over most of Italy. The Roman provinces, moreover, which were governed by officers sent out from Rome, included large territories in Spain, Africa, and Asia Minor, besides Greece, Macedonia, and northern Italy. From these conquered countries the Romans had brought home all the spoil they had been able to gather together. They thus had vessels of gold and silver, jewels of all kinds, fine clothes, beautiful furniture, and gems of painting and sculpture. They began to rival each other in the magnificence of their houses and dress, and in their delicately spread tables. There were more than 3 times as many slaves as freeborn citizens, owing to the many prisoners that were taken during these wars. So all the rich Romans had plenty of servants, and soon learned to be idle and hard to please. Some of these slaves were far better educated than their masters, for, with the conquest of Greece, many teachers and philosophers had been brought from there to instruct the Roman children. These men taught their pupils how to read Greek, so that they could enjoy all the fine and interesting things which had been written in that language, for the Romans had been so busy fighting until now that they had had no time to write history, stories, poems, and plays of their own. The Greek slaves, moreover, translated many of the masterpieces of their own literature into Latin, the language spoken by all the Romans. Thus, the Romans soon learned all about the heroes of Greece, read the teachings of their philosophers, and listened to their tragedies and comedies, which were played in the Roman theaters. From the countries they had conquered, the Romans had also brought back statues of the gods, and priests to serve them. These statues were later placed in a fine building called the Pantheon, or home for all the gods, where the Romans worshipped them as well as their own divinities. You have already heard that the Romans delighted in processions and shows, so you will easily understand that they encouraged their priests to celebrate the festivals of these foreign gods too. Then the Romans themselves took part in all of these processions with as much zest as if they had been in honor of their own gods. Another change which had taken place was that the Romans had become harsher and more selfish. They had made war so long that they now delighted in cruelty and excitement. To satisfy this craving, they built great circuses with raised seats all around the pit or arena, and came in throngs to watch their slaves fight against each other or against wild beasts. To make the show more exciting, some of the rich citizens had their slaves carefully trained for these combats. As they fought with a short sword, which in Latin is called a gladius, they were known as the gladiators, or swordsmen. These poor men were well fed, comfortably housed, but only so that they might grow handsome and strong, and excite more admiration when they appeared in the arena to fight. They were also taught to bow and walk, and even to fall and die gracefully, so as to afford the cruel Romans still more pleasure. When a gladiator fell after a brave resistance, the people sometimes wished to save his life, so that he could recover and come and amuse them again. As a signal to his opponent to spare him, they clapped their hands and waved their handkerchiefs. But if the poor gladiator had failed to please them, they ruthlessly turned their thumbs down, and thus condemned him to instant death, which they viewed with great indifference. Andronicus, a slave, was once sent into the arena to fight a lion. The people were surprised to see the beast fawn upon him instead of attacking. But when Andronicus explained that once when he was in the desert he had drawn a thorn out of a lion's paw, they were so pleased that they bade him go free and gave him the lion. End of chapter 49. Recording by Ryan Cherrick. Chapter 50 of the Story of the Romans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ryan Cherrick. The Story of the Romans by H.A. Gerber. Chapter 50. The Jewels of Cornelia. The Romans attended the circus so frequently that they daily learned to become more cruel and bloodthirsty, and they were in general very unkind to their slaves. Most of these were ill-clad and ill-fed, and were made to work very hard. They were severely whipped for every act of disobedience, but they were seldom rewarded or set free. The Roman citizens themselves, however, could do almost anything they pleased. When brought before a judge for any offense, they were sure of very lenient treatment, while all the slaves, or any who were not Roman citizens, were treated with the greatest severity for the same crimes. Thus, the mere name of Roman citizen was a safeguard, for none dared ill-treat him who bore it. This protection was given even to criminals who were sentenced to death, and while other men could be crucified, a Roman was never made to submit to that disgrace, but it was executed by the sword. With the increase in wealth and luxury, the contrast between the rich and the poor classes became more marked than ever. The rich reveled in plenty, while the poor almost starved. Some of the richest Romans of this time are said to have paid their cooks $5,000 a year, but none of them thought of the poor, who then had no hospitals, or homes, or charity bureaus to go when in need of help. As you have already heard, the plebeians had, at last, gained complete equality with the patricians, even in regard to the holding of office. The struggle between these two classes was over, and instead there began a contest between the rich and the poor. Some of the plebeians had become wealthy, and they and the old patricians formed a new class of nobles, who tried to keep all the offices in their hands, and to make themselves still richer. The land had at first been distributed among all citizens, but had now become the property of a few rich men, who had cultivated by their own slaves, and refused to sell the grain and vegetables at reasonable prices. The result was that many of the more poor plebeians, deprived of land and unable to secure work, crowded into the city. There they would have died of hunger, had not their own magistrates, the tribunes, sometimes dealt out them daily rations of grain. This idle and pauper class was growing almost larger, and as the people had nothing to do, they were unhappy and ready for mischief. Except for the circus, their only pleasure was to stand along the streets and watch the religious processions of the triumphs, and the returning generals soon found that the people would not even take the trouble to cheer them as of old, unless they scattered handfuls of small coin as they passed along. Many years before this, a law had been made forbidding any Roman citizen to own more than a certain amount of land. This law, which is known as Licinian law, did not please the rich men, so they paid no attention to it, but it was now time that it should be enforced, and that someone should take part of the oppressed people. The poor needed a champion who would fight for their rights, and they soon found an excellent one in the brave young Tiberius Gracchus, whom they elected to the office of tribune. This man was clever and fearless, and the people knew that he would do his very best to help them. Tiberius Gracchus, the champion of the poor, belonged to one of the most noted families of Rome. His father was a noble plebeian, and his mother, Cornelia, was the daughter of Scipio Africanus, the great general who had defeated the Carthaginians in the Second Punic War. Cornelia, we are told, was a noble woman and an excellent mother. She brought up her two sons herself, and felt very proud of them. A noble Roman lady once asked her to show her ornaments after she displayed her own, and Cornelia called her boys and said, "These are my jewels." On another occasion, some people were speaking of her father, and of all he had done, and were congratulating her upon being the daughter of so great a man. Cornelia, however, replied that she was prouder still of being called the mother of Gracchi, that is, of Tiberius and Caius Gracchus. End of chapter 50. Recording by Ryan Cherrick.